Did I warn you? Garibaldi, leaning against the wall of the office, raised an eyebrow, looking at Sheridan, who was leaning back tiredly in his chair. And this is only the first day of quarantine. It's good that we are in space, otherwise the crowd would have long ago torn down the barrier and fled Babylon 5 on foot. Your comments are incredibly optimistic, Michael, the captain sighed. As my grandfather used to say, the man sighed. Optimism is a consequence of insufficient information about the situation. And the situation was far from rosy. Dr. Franklin locked himself in the medical lab, trying to figure out how exactly the disease spreads and which other species it could affect. But there was still noticeably more questions than answers.
Sheridan himself, as promised, managed to talk to Ambassador Delenn. But the Minbari, unfortunately, could not help in any way. Despite the development of their technology, the fundamental approaches to Minbari medicine were not much different from those known on Earth, and they did not know about the Drafa plague at all. And the Minbari themselves were less susceptible to various kinds of infections. And on the station, the degree of tension at the station was increasing. Even the fact that Babylon was closed for departure or arrival of ships was already causing loud indignation among its inhabitants. And if you remember that the station was closed for quarantine due to a fatal disease, John could only pray to all known and unknown gods that the indignant crowd would not break into his office the next moment. And this could happen any minute now. Reports from security and medical personnel were pouring into Sheridan's terminal, and at that very moment they were continuing to search, inspect and examine all the markups on the Babylon without stopping to rest, trying to determine the scale of the disaster and the number of already infected representatives of this race. And the fact that the number of reports of discovered corpses had already exceeded 50 made the man on the grind his teeth. "Captain!" One of the security officers looked into the office. "You have a visitor, the markup ambassador." "Yes," the man sighed. "Let me through." "Captain Sheridan, this is simply outrageous." The ambassador, who had entered, quickly threw up his hands in irritation as he approached John. "You cannot treat my fellow citizens like this. The behavior of your employees. They are accused of concealing the disease." "Ambassador Fasher," Sheridan tried to intervene. "No, listen," Markup interrupted the man. "With your actions, you have provoked fear and hysteria. They are shying away from my people. Who gave you the right to do this? And I am not even talking about the fact that you have insulted their honor and dignity. This is immoral." "No one is accusing anyone of anything, Ambassador. What are you? You can say whatever you want. Maybe this is a conspiracy of the Earth Commonwealth to destroy my people." "What nonsense," Garibaldi couldn't help but say. "I believe that the infection was brought into our food. There were no problems before arriving at your station. Everyone was alive and well. It's all because of the immoral lifestyle. Yours, Captain, and your relatives. But this mistake can be easily corrected. We will isolate ourselves from your pernicious influence." "Ambassador Fashar, you..." "Captain." Franklin's very worried face appeared on the terminal display. "Wait, Doctor. It's urgent." "Ambassador, you cannot leave the station." The captain caught up with Fasher, who had started to leave. "We are isolating our people in a separate compartment to avoid contact with any of you, but you'll only make things worse. The virus..." "I don't want to listen to your nonsense, Captain. You've already done worse. Now just stay away from us." Ambassador Fasher, still literally seething with indignation, turned around and, clearly not intending to listen to anything more, headed for the exit. "Damn it," John breathed out. "Captain!" "Ah, yes? What's wrong, Doctor?" "Descend to Sector 17 immediately, sir." "And you, Garibaldi, what did you discover?" "According to the research results, the disease is transmitted through the air. It is already throughout the whole of Babylon, but that is not the main thing." "What else?" "I found a dead Pacamar." The medic looked somewhere to the side. "A victim of the plague?" Garibaldi asked tensely. "I can't say yet." Franklin shook his head. "Research is needed, but I am obliged to warn you about this possibility. This is the only thing we need to be completely happy." Although Stephen had told Sheridan that additional research was needed, and indeed it was needed, because the corpse itself didn't mean anything but intuition, premonition, experience. You can call it whatever you want. But something inside told Dr. Franklin that he would not like the results of the autopsy and research on the dead Pacmar very much. He called the medical team, and together they carried the body to the medical lab,
placing it in a hermetically sealed module usually used for operations on aliens that required a different atmosphere. But it was also perfect as a quarantine zone in the presence of a biological threat. So, the doctor sighed and looked around at the assembled specialists with a tired look. We need to perform a full autopsy before the boy has time to stiffen. The lab block is sealed, and you'll be wearing a biohazard suit, so... Only now did the man notice the unusual silence that reigned in the medical bay. A tense and uncertain silence. The assembled medics exchanged glances, but tried to stay away even from the glass that separated the lab box from the rest of the room, as if, Franklin sighed, they were afraid of getting infected, even despite all the precautions. Okay, he spread his hands. I'll do the autopsy myself, and you follow the readings from here. You'll be assisting... I have a better idea, Stephen. Lazaren's voice came from the entrance, making everyone turn around. This disease came from our world. I know what I'm dealing with. I'll perform an autopsy. Dr. Lazaren, if you... Franklin looked at the markup with bewilderment. After performing the autopsy, I will remain inside. Lazaren stopped the medic. If I get infected there, the disease will not come out. I want to help you, Stephen. Don't take this chance away from me. Fine. Franklin hadn't made the decision easily. After all, he had known Dr. Lazaren for many years, having had close contact on work and scientific issues, even before his arrival on Babylon 5. And in general, despite the cultural hang-ups, the markup was a very pleasant conversationalist. But Stephen couldn't help but acknowledge his right to do the right thing, and there was no particular sense in playing it safe. Whether Pakmara was sick to death or not, it was highly likely that everyone on the station had already encountered the plague, or would encounter it in the very near future. Thank you. The markup nodded, walking towards the sterilization airlock of the block. He ignored the protective suit, or at least the mask. I'm starting... Smiling sadly at the people behind the glass, Lazaren put on medical gloves with practiced movements and picked up a scalpel, beginning the examination and dissection of the corpse on the table. Dr. Franklin could only stand and watch, monitoring the parameters recorded by the computer in the medical box and the results of the sample analysis. Markab worked methodically and with concentration, clearly understanding more than just the anatomy of his own species. In total, the dissection took the doctor more than 3 hours. He approached his work thoroughly and took his time, afraid of missing something important. Finally, Lazarin handed over the last tissue sample he had taken for analysis and, tiredly pulling off his gloves, approached the glass of the box. You should rest, Stephen. The markup shook his head, noticing how Franklin injected himself with another dose of the stimulant. I can't. I need to wait for the results of the study, check all the samples. Third stimulant of the evening, bad for your health. If we don't find a solution, what kind of health are we talking about? The man shrugged. Any news? While I was doing the autopsy?
Not yet. Franklin shook his head. The samples will be finished in about 40 minutes.
But security has found 10 more dead markups. It's spreading after all. Lazaren sighed, frowning. Well, at least it seems like we managed to avoid unrest. Mr. Garibaldi knows his business, but how everyone loves to look for the guilty. The doctor threw up his hands in irritation. The Black Death, AIDS, Chalmers syndrome. Millions of deaths and we are still the same. Black Death. The markup asked inquisitively. What is it? The plague. It struck one of the Earth's continents several centuries ago. 3/4 of the population died then. Stephen smiled bitterly. Back then, everyone also believed that it was a punishment for sins and immoral behavior. They said that the disease was sent by the devil himself. And who were his favorites? Cats. The man just shook his head. They killed cats by the millions.
And they were the only means of fighting the carriers of infection, rats and fleas. By killing cats, people only help the plague kill itself. It seems to be becoming a tradition. Analyze the problem, choose the stupidest solution, and act. Without finishing, Lazaren swayed and almost fell to the floor, miraculously managing to lean on the bed with his hand. The markup's face clearly turned pale, and he himself began to breathe rapidly, as if he had just run several kilometers without stopping. The man straightened up with obvious difficulty, turning to Franklin. Dr. Lazaren. Here it is. Dr. Lazaren. Stephen pressed his face to the glass, worried. It all fits together, Stephen. A minute ago, my throat suddenly hurt, and now my head is spinning. Stephen, you needed a patient at an early stage of the disease. He's in front of you. Take some tests from me. Don't delay, Stephen. Doctor!
The woman who was analyzing the samples obtained from the Pakmar called out to Franklin. We have received the results of the Pakmar's autopsy. And what's there? The man snatched the printout, reading the testimony. The samples matched 98%. It's the plague, doctor. The doctor's eyes clearly showed serious fear. Damn it. Now, quick, Mitch, Tasabi. Stephen frowned. Take Sims and examine the body inch by inch. Look for similarities, little things, anything to figure out why the Pakmara got infected. The similarities between the victims will give us the answer. Sir. What? Didn't I say it clearly? We have to understand how this disease kills. There's little time. Doctor, the woman called out to her boss, her eyes wide with fear. Do you understand what this means? This means, Dr. Tyler, Franklin emphasized the last words with his tone, that we have more information than we had 5 minutes ago. We are doctors. Exhaustive information. A complete comparison of the victims of the epidemic, especially in light of the fact that they belong to different species. You have an hour, damn you, or I promise you. With each word, the head of the medical service of Babylon raised his voice, by the end raising it to a shout. I will arrange for you, sir, that the plague will seem to you a children's matinee. Quickly, I said. Results. We need results. The epidemic at the station was gaining momentum. Watching it from the front row was a somewhat different experience than sitting in front of the TV. So different that I even wondered if I was doing the right thing by deciding not to interfere in what was happening. However, if we discard all and any moral and emotional aspects of the issue, from the point of view of common sense and logic, everything was correct and reasonable. Even if I decided to intervene right now, even if I created a cure, there would still be the important issue of delivering it to patients. Vaccinating the markups and their biologically similar species on the station was no problem. But what about those who got sick on other planets? On the ships that left their homeworld at the very beginning? And those who managed to slip through the tenacious hands of security, leaving Babylon 5 a few hours before the quarantine was announced? Even with the capabilities of the replicators, the network gave only a 13.221% probability that everyone would receive the vaccine. And given the virulence of this plague, even I couldn't save the markups. Even if everyone I could reach survived, they were doomed as a civilization. Although Franklin clearly wasn't going to give up, the signal coming from the front door made me raise an eyebrow in surprise. A quarantine had been declared on the station, which, in theory, implied the need to stay in your cabins, not appearing in public places unless absolutely necessary, but the antisocial elements of the Babylon, persistently caught by Mr. Garibaldi and his valiant security service, or, as in this case, Ambassador Delenn, were clearly not too slow. However, I suppose it is unlikely that anyone other than Michael himself or one of the other senior officers would have risked stopping the Ambassador of Minbari going somewhere on her business with a confident look. Ambassador Delenn, Mr. Lanier? I opened the door to the cabin with an expression of polite surprise on my face. How can I help you? Lord Bal. Delenn bowed with some uncertainty. I apologize for our late and sudden visit. It's okay. I cordially invite the Minbari to come in. Did something happen to you?
Nothing like that. The woman shook her head, walking inside. I wanted to talk to you about the situation at the station. The plague? I sigh, gesturing to the guests to the sofa, taking the chair myself. Plague, Delenn nodded, sitting up. Lanier, who had found himself in my cabin, looked around with some dismay at the golden wall panels and the noticeably more rich appearance of the interior than any other ambassador's cabins on the station. Delenn's assistant himself remained standing, holding a small bundle in his hands, which could be identified as a small rug or thin mattress, probably used by the Minbari for meditation or other purposes. A tightly packed backpack was slung over the man's shoulder. The Minbari delegation was clearly up to something. Tell me, Lord Bal, there was longing and hidden pain from what was happening in the Minbari woman's eyes. I understand that this may be a strange or inappropriate question, but your civilization...
From what I have seen and heard, your civilization is superior in its level of development, not only to humans or markabs, but also to Minbar. And may my teachers forgive me for such loud statements. Delenn smiled slightly. I would say that your civilization is superior to everyone in this galaxy. The woman spoke carefully, choosing her words, carefully monitoring my reaction to each of them she uttered. And have we ever encountered anything like this? I asked the question for her. Yes. It would be strange to say, I sigh, that over many thousands of years of development, any civilization in the universe could have never encountered a deadly disease that threatened its existence. Although, I must admit, the Drafa plague that struck the Markup people is still incredibly effective. If your kind, have already seen something like this, isn't there a way to help them? The woman's companion couldn't help but ask. Lanier.
The woman snapped at her assistant. No, I smile. A completely natural question. Unfortunately, I throw up my hands. Although, in the history of our empire, of course, there were many diseases, in the current situation this will not be able to help. But why? I already had a conversation with Dr. Franklin, who came with exactly the same question as you, Ambassador. Representatives of my species do not get sick. I mean, at all. But how is this even possible? The lens eyes widened. To put it simply, I shrug, nanotechnology. Our science developed very intensively, and the question of the body's resistance to damage at one point became key and was resolved. Nanotechnology. The woman lowered her eyes thoughtfully. Unfortunately, I continue the thought, immunity to diseases cannot be transferred. Moreover, even if I had the opportunity to share with Dr. Franklin what protects me,
Or Coron with Yuki. I nod towards the door to the next room. Neither I, here and now, nor even more so on Earth, simply do not have the technology to adapt the method for the Markabs, and there simply isn't enough time.
it's terrible. Delenn sighed. Well, even an unfulfilled hope is still a hope. Just like you, I sincerely sympathize with the Markabs in such a difficult hour. I shake my head. Unfortunately, not everything in the universe happens the way we would like. I understand. The Minbari exchanged glances with Lanier, sighing. All that remains is to reassure ourselves that the universe is wiser than us. Alas, yes. What do you intend to do next, Ambassador? I cast a careful glance at the Minbari. Unless, of course, it is a secret. There is no secret. The woman shook her head sadly. I was going to ask Captain Sheridan to let me into the compartment where the Markabs are isolated. You hope to make their path easier. You understand me, Lord Baal? The woman nodded with pleasant surprise. The Markabs are suffering. They are afraid. And we know how to sympathize and support. To help at least with words if we are not capable of more. Besides, a note of fatalism appeared in Delenn's voice. If the disease affects only the Markabs, I will not forgive myself if I do not support them in such a dark hour. If it affects everyone on the station, then I can at least hope that when my turn comes, there will be someone nearby who can support me too. The woman rose from the sofa. Well, I stand up to meet the Minbari. If the worst comes to the worst, everyone will need support. I hope, I smile slightly, that I will not be the only one who can provide it. In any case, we can only hope that Dr. Franklin will cope with his work. He is an experienced doctor with an excellent team of employees. Thank you for your words of support, Delenn bowed.
Маржуньо нефтерове немание, których nie idą узкового dają czterowy.
Strawite się komanią proszto na to. Wažeju jaką kroské zvačla na kananie, jaką dworia vščestam dávajú, že izobokaže je drobavojickové manty. No, jaką też odzieja storia do wtunie i Minbari. To samca przystane je wycienie dasisjon komponut na siewa. Wažemu troje da naprawiący cięcia, jakie profszystęjatyk, arbet ktorano stovelianca procudy wynowady wroczy. Zaciastoją stublożaw się pokozawianowie niekamowianturej, zakomproznia wyściany jene zmatowiono gramej jest ułom, ona prawowojanistem na niej bastawą gramej. Japsosie stojeju humanoid replikatora w bokomorione na logen uzowią natu. Ważenie i dresą na joko korone jajuki inkoter szonde bisierze. A gurunia piebanie o bisierze. Zaszego żnienaru. Ja to pokałżanu niżką ktyru wazji. A z każdym katerna murzinih torwaną miną i jeściekowe nakodani obarda myą na słaga una. Ważyta konkluzjeneś murze enomem minoje. Zasuje na... Perhaps it is worth thinking about this at leisure and deciding how to relate to this. Interlude.
Degenerate space. All civilizations that had developed to a sufficient level to reach this place considered this space uninhabitable. Crimson-black shimmers, the absence of any landmarks or any large objects, complete chaos, and a jumble of all kinds of radiation that knocked down any sensors and made navigation so difficult that ships that lost a signal from special hyperspace beacons risked never again breaking out into normal space, at least in the known part of it. But this space was not for everyone. Those who had enough knowledge, or the ability to obtain this knowledge, knew that it was possible to live in hyperspace, not in the conditions familiar to any organic life form, because there are no planets here, and not without the limitations imposed by the bizarre laws of physics in this place. But, if you know how, everything is possible.
The object drifting through hyperspace was old, very old.
Deep furrows, like old wrinkles or scars, covered the iridescent purple-black surface. If a casual observer had been nearby, the completely unbelievable thought would have crept into his head that the strange spherical body, more like a huge sea urchin, bristling with hundreds of oily, shiny black needles, was a living organism. Its surface was so similar to the skin of an old, seasoned animal that had lived for more than 1,000 years. But the drifting sphere was not the only object among the crimson shimmers of degenerate space. Two ships were drifting just as well next to it. Small by the standards of this place, they would easily get lost in the endless emptiness of even ordinary space, let alone this place. Two ships, peacefully drifting like satellites of a tiny planet on opposite sides of the sphere in an absolutely impossible way.
Two ships, a black one, as if absorbing light with its surface causing a shiver with just one look, a spider and a small light purple flower. For many thousands of years, the Vorlons and the Shadows who had once created this place through their joint efforts had not appeared in this region of hyperspace. The hyperspace station was intended as neutral territory, a place to meet in a no-man's land of space and find a compromise, a unified solution, if such a need arose. For many thousands of years, there had been no dialogue. Both sides of such a long conflict had rejected the very idea of compromise, considering their view and their philosophy the only correct one. But now, nevertheless, they were here. The perfectly round hole, empty for many thousands of years, was illuminated by a bluish light and a shining bluish-white creature, most reminiscent of a strange inhabitant of the depths, like an earthly squid, passed right through one of the violet-black walls. They were already waiting for him on the opposite side of the hall. A praying mantis-like figure covered in numerous thorns, barely visible in the darkness, stood, as if in thought, slightly moving its upper pair of limbs from side to side. If there had been a casual observer in the room, able to understand what, and most importantly, who he was seeing, it would have become obvious to him that these were not ordinary representatives of their people. The Vorlon and the Shadow, the figure of light and the spot of darkness. They were both strikingly different from what these two species looked like in normal conditions. The glowing figure hovering in the air seemed to blur in space, emitting translucent copies of itself, as if it were trying to split into many separate figures, nevertheless connected as one.
And the shadow. The shadow was a shadow around the figure, barely noticeable in the darkness that reigned around. The cloud of darkness swirled, occasionally pierced by short flashes of golden dots, more like many intently watching eyes. There was a vacuum in the hall. The representatives of the two ancient civilizations had, by and large, not needed the atmosphere for a long time. However, even if it were here, not a single sound would penetrate the space. The representatives of the two ancient civilizations had not used verbal methods of communication for many millennia. To communicate with younger species if such a need arose, yes, but not among themselves. But still, here and now there was a conversation, filled with many meanings and types of information content. A conversation intended to resolve the issue, because of which two long-time rivals temporarily cast aside the contradictions of their views on the world order and met on neutral territory.
A new force had appeared in the galaxy, a force whose limits neither the Vorlons nor the Shadows understood and could not estimate with any sufficient reliability and accuracy. And such a force had to be reckoned with. If that mythical, casual observer were also a telepath, capable of perceiving the dense and fast flow of information transmitted by both sides, he would have been able to see the huge golden pyramid that was destroying the smaller,
but clearly combat ships of the Drazi race. He would have noted the impressive speed of movement of this strange ship. Incredible and hardly possible for the younger civilizations of this corner of the universe. And among this flow of data, one name was clearly readable: Lord Baal. A name familiar to both ancient races, although it evoked completely different emotions.
The silent mental dialogue lasted an incredibly long time for such a method of exchanging information. More than 2 hours by Earth standards, although here, in hyperspace, the concept of time was very, very relative. Due to the lack of any reference points for assessing its flow, finally the glowing figure of the Vorlon shone brighter for a moment and then seemed to turn in on itself, silently moving away through the same wall through which it had appeared in this hall. The shadow, left alone, thoughtfully moved its spiky limbs, causing a slight oscillation of the cloud of darkness enveloping it, and also left the hall, simply dissolving into space. A few moments later, the ships that had brought the high contracting parties to the council departed from the meeting place. Only the ancient spiky sphere remained, silently continuing to drift in the endless confines of degenerate space, patiently waiting for its existence to gain meaning again.
The sphere was very, very old, but it was precisely this endless waiting that was the main essence of its nature. For this it had been created many thousands of years ago. Lord Refa? Longdo blinked in surprise, seeing the dignitary's face on the long-distance display. Refa's call itself was nothing special. They communicated with each other not so rarely, especially now, in the midst of the war with Narn, discussing affairs, events in their homeland, information about which Mollari on Babylon 5 sometimes received with some delay. No, what was more surprising was the background. Londo's comrade was clearly in the throne room of the Imperial Palace on Centauri Prime, conducting a conversation from a special communication terminal installed there. Actually, this fact was also not completely unbelievable. But the fact that there was not a single living soul in the room, and especially the Emperor himself was not there.
А за позожану, который с терминальпа, да ваш озернаи encryptaем communication, кому я способен стать пособленнее, продел сайтку раску именение, как рейши налли, и знание выраз кажду. Лондо, l'ambassador's interlocutor smiled. Glad to see you. What's going on at your station? I heard there are some problems there. Unfortunately, yes. Nodded Mollari. Babylon 5 is closed for quarantine. The departure and arrival of any ships is prohibited. Epidemic. What a horror. The man shook his head. I sincerely hope that the problem will be solved as soon as possible. You, I see, look good. On the contrary, the ambassador smiled, nodding towards the display. Turbulent times, Mollari, shrugged Drefa. It makes the blood and mind boil. Speaking of which, Emperor Carthagia has finally made a decision. The conflict with the Narns must end. And where is he himself?
He is with his people. The man waved his hand. He takes pleasure in the almost sincere worship and love of the masses. He very wisely handed over the reins of the Republic to the court, and the court works just as well and reliably without him as it does with his presence. Sometimes even better, Lord Refa chuckled. The main thing is that he values his position and ours, and yours. It hasn't been easy for you lately, Mollari. Our work already cost me my friend's life, Refa. Londo grimaced. How many more do you have in line? Despite all his diplomatic skills and ability to keep a straight face when the situation demanded it, Jadu Mollari could not forgive Urza's death, especially in light of the fact that he himself had dealt this blow, and he would have to live with this for the rest of his days. But still, the man knew perfectly well where the source of the entire situation was. Now he felt as if he was torn between two fires. The awareness of the state necessity that required cooperation with Rifa and the thirst for revenge, the voice of which pushed him to do things that were completely inappropriate now. What happened to Jado was an incredibly unfortunate event, Londo. Rifa shook his head in mock sympathy. But for the sake of our people, we must accept the consequences of mistakes and learn from them in order to move forward. Lord Rifa, Mollari's face turned to stone. I am quite tired today. Is there a reason why you contacted me now? Of course there is, Rifa smiled broadly. And it is a very good one. As I said, the Emperor has realized that the war that began 6 months ago must be ended, and it will happen soon, much sooner than we could have imagined. And you, Londo, will play a significant role in this process.
Of course.
The man spread his hands. You will not be able to take direct part since you cannot leave Babylon 5, but your contribution to the victory will not be forgotten, I promise. I don't understand. We have intercepted important information. The Narns are planning to attack Gorrash 7. This could be disinformation, Londo thought, to attack elsewhere. Yes, Rifa waved it off. I've heard this point of view before, but I don't think so. This seems like a step of desperation. So, our fleet will be waiting for them at Gorrash 7? But I still don't understand what this has to do with me. Not exactly, the man smiled. What? The ambassador leaned towards the display. They will destroy the colony if there is no defense. You said it yourself. You didn't let me finish. Your forces will meet the Narns at Gorrash 7, and the main fleet will head to Narn. Narnu, this is the capital word. They will drown our troops in blood to capture the capital.
This is madness.
And who's talking about a takeover? A satisfied smile blossomed on the Centauri's face. We don't need a takeover. We'll crush them. I've already ordered the mass drivers to be ready. When the fleet is finished, the army will only have to take over the ruins. Mass drivers on a densely populated world? Refa, I sent a report on Lord Baal's statement. Every Narn planet has... I read that document. Londo, do you really think that this Lord Baal will do what he said? That's a political statement. Horror story. He doesn't... Are you an idiot, Refa? I gave very specific comments. This is madness. No need to try to insult me, Molari. The dignitary grimaced. No matter how absurd and incredible the words of this alien sounded, of course I took them into account. And took precautions. And what kind? At the same time as your
Allies attacked the Narn fleet at Gorrash 7, and our own attack on Narn. Small fleets will arrive at 3 more distant Narn colonies. Nothing special, a resource base and 2 shipyards for repairing their cruisers. But the main thing is that these worlds are located very far from each other, and the attacks will be timed in such a way that he will not be able to arrive at all 4 points at the same time. You don't think that Baal will send a full-fledged battle fleet to back up his statement? Are you crazy? 1 battle, Molari. 1 strike from our ships, and the war will be over in a few days. Do you understand that or not? The situation could get out of control. My allies, we have no choice, Londo. This is a direct order from Emperor Cartagia. Rifa pressed a few buttons on the terminal, and Molari, exhaling in resignation, looked down, looking at the official imperial decree sent to him from his homeland. Everything was more serious than ever.
Either a crazy plan or an accusation of rebellion following Urza. Okay, Refa. Londo almost growled irritably. I will turn to my allies. But all the consequences of this, they will all be on your conscience.
There will be no consequences. The plan is perfect. Thank you, Londo. I will send you the data on the planned attack. It has all the timestamps, all the details. Use it.
Rifa nodded to the ambassador, disconnecting, and Molari's terminal quietly beeped, reporting the receipt of an encrypted data packet. Letting out a heavy half-sigh, half-groan, the Centauri rubbed his face with his palms, glad only that Veer was not nearby, who would certainly not fail to speak up about exactly what depth of the pit his boss had just agreed to dive headlong into. But there was little time. It was necessary to study Rifa's plan and contact Morden, and then all that was left was to hope that the price of all this would not be too high. Chapter 50. When things went wrong. Not every change leads to improvement, but to improve something, you first need to change it. Georg Lichtenberg, scientist, philosopher, and publicist. At such moments, I experienced a dual and extremely strange feeling. On the one hand,
I had an almost irresistible desire to depict the legendary gesture of putting the palm to the face, popularly called facepalm. And, on the other hand, I was incredibly happy that I was a replicator whose body is absolutely immune to ordinary physical damage. Facepalm would have been too epic in my case. You can do Hulk crush with such blows. Londo, Centauri Republic ambassador. Londo Mollari, with a completely serious face, was conducting secret negotiations with Lord Refa via a direct line from Babylon 5 station back home to Centauri Prime, openly discussing plans to attack the Narn capital world with a banned weapon of mass destruction. What the hell was that? No.
Theoretically, it was understandable. The communication channel was diplomatic, had jaw-dropping encryption, and was intended for direct communication between the ambassador and the emperor in case of emergency. But seriously? The words diplomatic espionage no longer exist in this galaxy? Or what? Or what? However, the personnel of Babylon itself were surprisingly honest, and apart from the tracking equipment of the replicators, long ago reliably and efficiently integrated into all the station's systems, no one was watching the ambassadors. At least, not centrally and officially. All surveillance measures, including cameras and microphones, were limited to the corridors of the embassy sector and several official conference rooms, the cases of whose use for their intended purpose could be counted on the fingers of one hand. In any case, Mollari himself surprisingly appeared as the voice of reason in this situation. He nevertheless made an attempt to convey to Rif the idea that his and Emperor Cartagia's decision to carry out such a brazen attack was nothing more than a particularly perverted method of suicide, both political and physical. True, it didn't help too much. I had to decide on the choice of further ways of developing the situation. No, in the case of Narn itself, everything was crystal clear. Mass drivers in the format of an orbital bombardment of the capital world were the very involvement of the civilian population in an armed confrontation, which I had directly warned both sides of the conflict about. Well, if they did not heed the voice of reason, although I knew for sure that Londo had indeed sent home a very, very detailed report on that incident at Babylon 5 and the council meeting that followed, we would apply educational measures. But the supposed attack of the Narns themselves on the Goresh 7 already raised some questions. If Londo really managed to convince the Shadows through Mr. Morden to send ships for an honorary meeting of the Narn fleet, this very fleet would end before it began. And I was more than sure that the Shadows would accept such a request with great enthusiasm, regretting only that they were not asked to fly to Narn as well. And the main question was precisely whether I should take an active part in this performance. Common sense told me that there was no need for such a thing, although somewhere deep in my soul, a tiny worm of a desire to cause a fuss was gnawing. Lord Baal, I apologize for such an unexpected visit. The signal from the front door made me turn in her direction, and the fact that Ambassador Mollari was standing in the corridor was worthy of a raised eyebrow. Ambassador Mollari, maintaining an interested, surprised face, I give the command to open the door, letting the Centaurian into the cabin. I'm not entirely sure that I should have come, but the remnants of my common sense still demanded that I do just that. In contrast to his usual manner of behavior, this time Mollari looked very, very tense and unsure. I'm listening, Ambassador, I nod. First of all, I must say that this visit was not sanctioned by my government, and if it becomes known, I risk not only my position in society, the Centauri exhaled, but also my life. But contrary to the general opinion about me, I still have some notions of dignity, Londo grimaced. Characteristically, the ambassador continued to stand all this time, taking only a step inside the cabin and waiting for the door to close. Usually Mollari behaved much more freely and sometimes even impudently, but now he was much more collected, focused and serious. I can assure you, Ambassador Mollari, I spread my hands. Whatever you come to me with now, the content of this conversation will not go beyond the confines of my cabin. Thank you. Londo nodded. I came to warn my government
Emperor Tohan's successor, Cartaia, The Centauri closed his eyes for a moment, collecting himself, twitched his cheek in irritation, and finally, in one breath, said why, in fact, he came. In 23 hours, the fleet of the Centauri Republic will arrive in the space of the planetary system of Narn to deliver a massive and, as they believe, crushing blow to the planet Narn itself. By decree of the Emperor, an orbital bombardment of the surface has been approved using… Londo hesitated for a moment, gritting his teeth. Mass drivers. After that, the army will deal with the survivors. What? For 3 long seconds, silence reigned in the cabin. Simply because Centauri Ambassador Londo Mollari came to warn someone in advance about the upcoming bacchanalia that his state was going to start in the war with the Narns. What? The only thing missing to complete the set was for him to also come to Jekar, although of course such an act would not end well, except perhaps his sudden death at the hands of a Narn. In the remaining time, it would be problematic even to simply prepare the planetary garrison for the upcoming attack, not to mention evacuate civilians to bunkers or drive an additional fleet to the planet. This is a very unexpected statement, Ambassador Mollari. I look at the Centauri with respectful surprise on my face. Unlike those brainless blockheads in the government, I know how to use my brain, Lord Baal. And I heard and understood your words perfectly well at that council meeting regarding the protection of the non-civilian population.
Unfortunately, Londo's face twisted as if he had just eaten a lemon. It seems that my report was simply used to wipe their ass without being read. This is a sad development, I nod, sighing. I understand that you came to tell me about this in advance to avoid, if possible… We are at war with the Narn, the ambassador interrupted me, and this fact cannot be changed. We want to kill them, they want to kill us, but the use of weapons of mass destruction on the capital planet, I realize that in the eyes of you and all the other ambassadors, I may seem quite inadequately reasonable, but I sincerely wish prosperity for my people. Therefore, yes, the man looked me in the eye. I came to you personally to inform you of the decision of my government in order to, if possible, avoid excessive escalation of the situation. I understand you, Ambassador Mollari, I nod to the man. Your decision, especially in the current situation, is worthy of respect.
However, if you are afraid of a response from the Goa'uld Empire towards the Centauri, I can only say that, according to the instructions I have already received from my government, the participation of the Goa'uld in the confrontation will be strictly verified and targeted. As I have already said, we will prevent the involvement of the civilian population in military actions. However, this is not a sufficient reason to declare exterminatus of the worlds of the Centauri Republic. What? Londo tensed up and even turned slightly pale. Believe me, Ambassador, I smile. You don't want to know this. Well, Londo sighed, slumping his shoulders. This is more than I could have hoped for, Lord Baal. Once again, I ask you to forgive me for such an unceremonious visit. We are all sometimes forced to do things that must be done, I shrug. Less often. Have a good day, Lord Baal. And to you too, Ambassador. Londo, looking even busier than when he first came to me, nodded, slowly leaving the cabin. It was curious, though. It seemed that Mr. Mollari's common sense had begun to awaken a little earlier than it had in the original story. Or had his nerves simply given out? First the death of a friend from his youth, then the quarantine on the station, which had miraculously not turned into a group funeral. And now, just as the previous problem had just dissipated, the universe had thrown him another one. From the corridor, perfectly heard by the replicator sensors, came the measured blows of something hard hitting something metallic. Only after leaving my cabin and literally walking to the nearest turn in the corridor, Londo let out a tired and very melancholy howl, leaned his back against the wall, and began methodically banging his head against the metal panels of the covering, swearing dirty and very inventively, alternating between Centauri, human, and Narn languages. It seems what was happening bothered him much more than he tried not to show. Interlude. The scorching sun mercilessly burned his naked torso, and his calloused arms, holding a massive basket of stones on his shoulder, had been aching for hours.
What's more, he couldn't even remember the last time he hadn't experienced all these wonderful sensations. It seemed like he had been here and now for an eternity. However, he was not alone in this misfortune. Morden sighed heavily, looking furtively over his shoulder. As long as no one was looking at him, as long as no one was watching, he could allow himself a short break. "You'd better continue working." A rustling whisper from the side made the man turn sharply towards the sound. In front of him, dressed in exactly the same crude loincloth, stood for a moment a tall and thin man? No, his fellow sufferer looked quite human, but Morden looked down at his hands, then back at the creature that moved slowly, with obvious difficulty, further down the inclined stone ramp. A man. Or was it? Something about his appearance was wrong. Something made the man itch somewhere in the depths of his head. Black, as if drenched in oil, skin. Were there people so dark-skinned? Negroes. He knew about the Negro race, but although they could be dark, almost black, but the one who had warned him against idleness was somehow wrong. 2 long arms, leaving the impression more of the paws of some insect. Skin that seemed to absorb light. Everything was wrong. The figure, which had gone several meters up the ramp, seemed to be covered for a moment by a cloud of smoke, behind which Morden, barely holding back a frightened scream, saw a grotesque, completely inhuman figure, which was a pile of spikes and an angular, also spiked head.
The man closed his eyes until his eyeballs hurt, and when he forced his eyelids to rise again, everything was still the tall figure of a black humanoid, continuing to walk up, and the mercilessly scorching sun pressing down from above, directly on his head. Only now did he realize to raise his gaze a little higher and look around. And from what he saw, he felt a chilling chill running down his spine. A desert. Around him, as far as the eye could see, there was one continuous desert, on the surface of which, at some distance from each other, were located huge, irregular pyramids built from huge stone blocks. Some looked ancient, like time itself. Some had been built quite recently, not having had time to smooth out even in the slightest degree under the blows of the elements and the past centuries, and some, like the one on which he was now standing, were still being built, and all, as one, by the hands of slaves.
He saw them all, even though he couldn't make out their faces and figures, hundreds, thousands of faceless figures silently scurrying up and down the sandy embankments, lifting stones up and dragging cyclopean blocks. What was this? "Don't sleep!" A disgruntled but strikingly familiar voice rang out, and his back burned as if from the sting of 100 wasps. "Labor made a man out of a monkey, Mr. Morden." Turning around, the man shuddered, seeing the satisfied and smiling face of Lord Baal, patting his open palm with a long leather whip. "And since the universe has shied away in your case, I will do everything in my power to complete this complex process." Grinning widely, Baal raised the whip again. There was a loud click. Morden cringed in anticipation of the inevitable pain, feeling the heavy basket he was carrying on his shoulder fall, scattering stones. And with a hoarse breath, he opened his eyes, sitting up on the bed. What the hell?
То зжадав імсри хошози, пошую пеняцава копарді шуртинних стругої холи. Із кожи туарцах томих, киглазинарій написовышу в оборотине. Каждый узнай своя тишья сыналя первузней. Мордзенска вице-анела, анахине зачильная, и вова мужчив в буи с вощами, стоят на пене с кабином Babylon 5. Яса. Вахаренне, 100 реалицне, 100 к 100 больне. Русины с вами холоком и со, и нишани был каждый полноран нормаля. Каждый сосана доктыриная, потому что с тебой вони. It was just a dream. A dream. Мордзен сужив носияка. Dream? Возимонный ворлорд Гестен на голой актоминной визде. Что еще симкуляне защеннивка, Нарн амбассадорный Babylon 5, Гекар, так и вас петресив, что и сечанне фировать на потожие. И нишу може...
Although he pretended to brush off his relative's fears about the upcoming Narn attack on Gorash 7, he still could not completely ignore Jekar's arguments. The ambassador was right. The Centauri never withdrew all the ships from a controlled system, and even more so, they would not do this to a captured Narn system, leaving the newly captured inhabitants without control and overseers. And that meant they had something in mind.
planned some move that required all the free ships from them. And here Sheridan agreed with his nephew. The goal for such an undertaking must be very important and large. At first, the Narn did not pay much attention to Jakar's statement. Besides, the plan was approved by the majority of Khari and did not imply changes after its implementation began. But
Even after entering hyperspace, even after the ships of the Narn fleet began to move, moving towards the planet in the Centauri Republic space, he did not stop scrolling through the new information in his head. The Centauri captured 2 colonies, placed a fleet there, sent infantry to the planets to suppress resistance and control the prisoners, and then, suddenly, just left. In full force without even leaving a frigate to observe the system. Anyone but the Centauri. Satur! Gesten hissed in annoyance as he contacted the captain of one of the cruisers, who was in charge of a separate group of ships in the Narn fleet. I am listening, Commander Gesten. The elderly Narn's face that appeared on the terminal display was focused and full of attention. The plan is changing. Take your squadron and 2 heavy cruisers of Nassor as reinforcements. Go to Narn. I will send the order to Captain Nassor immediately after the end of the communication session. Gesten, Satur frowned.
This is against the plan. What's going on? The Khari agreed to attack Gora 7 and now at the last minute you're changing everything? Steering the ships away from all the planets was a bad idea, especially in light of the new information from my nephew on Babylon 5. This all looks too much like a trap, and if this leaves Narn defenseless against attack, should the Centauri decide to do so. But the captain frowned in confusion. So you lose 7 ships. And what if Gora 7 defends itself more seriously than we think? Then I'll jump back. Gesten shook his head. We'll go after the planet's satellite even if they're waiting for us. Even in the worst case, most of the fleet will be able to leave the battle and jump into hyperspace. I understand. The captain nodded and disconnected, and Gesten, as he had said, prepared an order to transfer some of the ships to another group.
The commander's finger paused for a moment over the send button, but the Narn sighed and pressed it anyway. If he had acted rashly, he would answer for his decision, but his conscience would be clear. The Narn would not be left without protection. It took some time to complete all the formalities, but an hour later, the 7 ships under Captain Satur's command turned around, heading back to the Narn Regime capital world, while the rest of the fleet continued on into hyperspace. There were still 6 hours to Gorash 7, and the premonitions were becoming increasingly unpleasant. Narn, the capital planet and mother world of the species of the same name. It was once a prosperous world, full of life and vegetation, but the first Centauri invasion distorted the ecology and climate of this planet beyond recognition. Almost all forests were cut down, the atmosphere became noticeably poorer, and the amount of atmospheric water fell to a minimum.
now the vast majority of the terrain here was lifeless red-pink deserts, only occasionally, in particularly remote corners brightened by patches of surviving vegetation. But even in such conditions, the tough and resilient Narns continued to do what they were used to doing to survive. Over the past 50 years, everything possible had been done to restore the ecosystem and biosphere, and although noticeable results were still a long way off, every Narn knew that his children, or his children's children, but they would once again be able to breathe deeply and enjoy the rustling of leaves in a light breeze. But now there was still much work to do. Farmer Turask tiredly wiped his forehead and adjusted his oxygen mask. It was difficult to cultivate the soil in the current conditions, but if not him, then who?
Even in the atmosphere that had become poorer in oxygen and the polluted soil, specially bread crops continued to grow successfully, not only providing the inhabitants with food, but also, a bit slowly but surely, restoring the world around them. A patch here, a piece there. Turask was happy with even such small changes. Raising his head to the sky, stretching his neck, the Narn froze, his pupils widening as he looked at the scene that opened up to his eyes. Visible even through the almost never-ending cloud cover that had become habitual, the shining funnels of hyperspace transitions flashed brightly and unfolded above the planet. 1, 2, 3. There was nothing unusual in the very fact of the ship's arrival at Narn, but they had never entered normal space so close to the planet. Obeying his intuition, Turask rushed headlong toward his house, shouting to his wife and son as he went, so that they could take refuge in the cellar.
The ships of the Centauri Republic
the silhouette of one of which the farmer had managed to recognize despite the distance, usually did not fly to Narn either. Lord Refa stood on the command bridge of the Valerius, the Centauri flagship, looking down at the dark and somehow dirty ball of Narn below, an expression of anticipation on his face. There was something incredible in feeling the colossal power that was now practically in his sole control by decree of the Emperor Cartagia. Here and now he was the representative of the supreme authority of the Republic. The captains of the ships, including the commander of the group, Saris Dodonni, an elderly but incredibly experienced naval commander, had to carry out his every order. Yes, the power was enormous. Lord Refa! Saris approached the man with a respectful bow. The ships are moving into attack range. Is the plan still the same? Of course, the Centauri grinned contentedly.
As soon as the fleet is lined up, use mass drivers. What about defense, Narn? Go old? The sensors don't detect any ships near the planet. Dodoni shook his head. Only an object in the form of a golden pyramid near the transition zone. I assume that's the Goa'uld Empire's observation station? Yes, the interrogated Narns described her exactly like that. Okay, Rifa rubbed his hands contentedly. As soon as you're ready, Captain. Yes, sir. Saris nodded briefly and turned on his heels, heading towards his chair. Rifa once again glanced at the planet below. Mass drivers. A wonderful example of the destructive power available to a highly developed civilization. In essence, this weapon was a primitive in its principle, but no less monstrous gravitational catapult. The mass driver's charging chamber was an area with a controlled gravitational vector, into which a specially oriented hyperspace transition funnel generator emerged. Tiny but performing all the required functions.
A pinpoint puncture of hyperspace directed towards the asteroid belt closest to the ship's location pulled out a stone block of a given size, or a scattering of smaller blocks, which did not greatly affect the result, and transferred this mass to the weapon's loading chamber. Then the gravitational field generators acted, compacting and gluing the resulting matter into one solid object, and accelerating it to a monstrous speed, sending it to the target. In case there were no asteroids, the ship had a certain supply of hard alloy projectiles at its disposal, capable of ensuring sufficient effectiveness of destruction. But in this case, the Centaurians were lucky, while the Narns were not so lucky. Rifa listened to the captain's orders. The charging chambers of all ships equipped with mass drivers were ready. All that was left was to give the command and… The next moment, when the first of the ships had already begun to increase the field intensity in preparation for the acceleration of a 1,000-ton boulder, an alarm about the appearance of unidentified targets suddenly roared. If the Valerius had been turned in the opposite direction, Refa would have been able to see with his own eyes how a bluish cloud flashed brightly in the emptiness of space, from which, having impossibly quickly reduced its speed, a ship emerged. A perfect golden pyramid, around the base of which a triangular structure was built with parts protruding to the sides like long spikes. One of Lord Baal's ships. Lord Refa, Captain Saris called out to the man, frowning as he read the readings on the display. An unidentified ship has just entered normal space. Length, width, and height. It is a perfect pyramid with a side of more than 2 kilometers, not counting the superstructure around one of the bases. And
We can't read any more data. The sensors don't see it. It's a Goa'uld ship, the Centauri grimaced, approaching the captain's chair. He's calm, just as he threatened. It doesn't matter that we have a numerical advantage. Besides, we have every right. We're at war after all. Turn one of the ships around. If we're attacked, we'll fight back. But for now, maybe we should call them. No need. This is the promised control, the dignitary chuckled, shaking his head, to ensure that the civilian population is not drawn into military action. I don't think the Goa'uld would want to start a war with the Centauri for the sake of the Narns. The Goa'uld attack approached the planet, hovered at some distance, away from the Centauri ships, and froze. There were no requests for communication, nor any other active actions on its part.
Captain Dodoni, having waited for confirmation from the ship captains about the readiness of the mass drivers, nodded briefly in response to Refa's questioning look in his direction. Fire and readiness. Yes, sir. The Centauri ships fired a coordinated salvo of gravity-accelerated asteroids, dealing… At exactly the same moment that Saris confirmed the order to the gun operator to attack,
A scattering of brightly shining blue sparks struck from the Goa'uld ship, hanging motionless next to the fleet. The Donnie only had time to note that the sensor readings were giving some absolutely absurd information on this type of weapon, and the next moment the salvo of the Huttak reached its targets, each of the sparks hitting one ship, completely disabling all active systems. Guns, artificial gravity, life support, lighting. The entire fleet of the Centauri Republic that had arrived at Narn in a single moment turned into pieces of metal floating in the void. In the name of the Creator,
Reeve whispered, in a suddenly hoarse voice, clutching the metal handrail with fingers whitened from tension.
What kind of weapon is this? Report. Not a single system is working. Only... A loud blow shook the hull of the Valerius, and the picture outside the observation window shifted slightly. What was that? It seems the asteroid has shifted, hitting the gun hull. We have lost all power. None of the systems are working. One single ship disabled an entire fleet, and did it with one salvo. Lord Refa at that moment, perhaps for the first time in his life, thought that he was clearly wrong about something, and that something was ignoring the warnings of Ambassador Molari. Can you do something? We're trying. Damn it. I can't even contact engineering. Saris slammed his armrest in frustration. But they should have started restoring power. There are backup systems. But how could they even de-energize an entire ship? I can only guess.
It could have been an electromagnetic pulse, but through all the shielding, through the hull,
Dodoni shook his head. Such a pulse must have absolutely jaw-dropping characteristics. Captain! One of the officers called out to the Centaurian. Look! This is all we need. The captain exhaled in confusion, turning to the porthole. At a distance from the Centauri ships, beyond the planet's satellite, hyperspace transition funnels opened up. Funnels from which the Narn ships were slowly and inevitably emerging. 7 ships. But there could just as easily have been 2 or 27. Without power supply, Lord Refa, still holding onto the handrail, literally felt with his whole skin how the last moments of life were slipping away like sand through his fingers. Well,
as pleasantly surprised as Molari was by demonstrating the awakening of the remnants of his sanity, the rest of the Centauri, led by the ever-memorable Lord Refa, spit in my soul in the same way. I had never expected such a comprehensive lack of self-preservation instinct in intelligent beings. That is why when the Huttak disabled the Centauri fleet, I left it drifting near Narn, taking the ship back out of the system, only answering the question of the captain of one of the Narn ships that had arrived at the planet, puzzled by such a gift, saying, "Did I promise to protect the civilian population from being drawn into military action? I did it. The fate of the military does not interest me." Considering the numerical superiority of the Centauri, they had, albeit microscopic, chances to restore power and escape home, but the number of ships would be noticeably reduced. However, I sincerely believe that stupidity must be paid for, so I did not intend to interfere in what was happening more than necessary. Moreover, several Centauri ships, 2 to be exact, still managed to avoid destruction. The Narn ships that arrived at the planet took their old enemies seriously, methodically shooting at such convenient targets in the space shooting gallery. But the spilling rage did them a disservice. Carried away by shooting helpless targets, the Narns did not think about the preventive disabling of the propulsion systems of all ships. That is why, although they received quite significant damage, 2 ships managed to jump into hyperspace at the last second, thereby saving their own lives. In any case, the Centauri attack on Narn caused a loud information boom. information about the attack on the Narn capital world reached Babylon almost an hour after the ships arrived to the planet. It's not surprising that the officer corps of the station, headed by Mr. Garibaldi, and the entire security service were literally put on their ears, raised by the alarm. And perhaps the only place of a large concentration of residents to which the wave of unrest did not roll was one modest café, in which at that moment sat 2 eared lovers of cakes. No, seriously. Corona and Yuki made such an unforgettable impression on the 3 Narns and 2 Centauri who started a fight in the common room of the establishment that it took only one flight through the open door to the outside for them to rethink their priorities and look for another place to sort things out. I didn't even comment on this scene.
Despite the timely intervention of the Goa'uld Empire,
which prevented the direct use of weapons of mass destruction during the planetary bombardment of Narn. The governments of Earth, Minbar, Vorlon, and several other states have lodged an official protest with the Centauri Republic regarding the use of mass drivers against the civilian population of the planet. There has been no response from the Centauri government at this time, although Ambassador Malari, aboard the Earth Alliance diplomatic station Babylon 5, has stated his intention to give official comments on the events in the near future. Narn Regime Ambassador Jakar also declined to be interviewed, limiting himself to a statement about the upcoming official statement on behalf of his government. Thus, what are the
Any forecasts by analysts have become practically useless, since they did not take into account the effective intervention of a third party in the person of the Gold Empire, which wished to act as a peacemaker in the course of the Centauri-Narn conflict. We will keep you informed of events. The news reports, repeated with minor changes, continue to cover such a high-profile event, but it was quite obvious that without official statements from either side, it was impossible to make any credible predictions at all. Reporters even tried to get to me to hear a qualified opinion on the expected developments, but I kept a mysterious silence. I simply did not open the door, joining the official policy of no comment. The terminal beeped softly, signaling notification as planned. Molari and Jakar were convening the Babylon 5 Advisory Council to make statements on the current situation. Interesting. As I recall, in the original story, when the Centauri successfully launched an orbital bombardment of the planet's surface, the main topics of this meeting were Londa's triumphant pride and Jakar's humbled pride in turning to Sheridan for diplomatic asylum as a member of the Kari. Now things were a little different. We'll see. All the invited participants of the meeting gradually made their way into the council hall. Judging by the arriving ambassadors of the states of the League of Non-Aligned Worlds, the ambassadors decided to cover the controversial and highly dubious situation in full in order to avoid further misinterpretations. Only the clearly tense Jakar was sitting in the presidium for now, having abruptly risen from his chair, having barely noticed my appearance in the room. Lord Bale. The Narn ambassador approached me.
Despite the gravity of the situation, I cannot express in words how grateful I am to you and your government for the decision to protect our worlds. The heatedly speaking Jakar grabbed my hand with both palms. Without your ship's participation in the battle in Narn orbit, without your help, my home world would have already been destroyed. Ambassador Jakar, I nod to the man, smiling slightly. The Goa'uld Empire strictly adheres to its chosen position. The civilian population should not be drawn into military action against their will, especially in a situation where it is impossible to somehow influence what is happening. I shake my head. Orbital bombardment with asteroids. Although I cannot help but admit the elegance of the technological solution of mass drivers. As a device, this is still a monstrous use of weapons of mass destruction on a defenseless population. And I am incredibly grateful to you. The ambassador straightened up, putting his hands to his chest and bowing his head low. Thanks to your intervention, we were not only able to repel the Centauri attack on Narn. The ships that arrived on the planet were able to knock out many of the enemy's most heavily armed vessels. I thank you. Jakar bowed again and, exhaling, returned to his place. It took some time for the ambassadors of all the nations represented on the Babylon to assemble in the council chamber, along with Captain Sheridan as the official representative of the Earth Commonwealth and the station's commander. Malari was the last to arrive, and he looked far more gloomy and concerned than Jakar. After casting a quick glance at his opponent, the Centauri silently took his place at the opposite end of the presidium table.
Ambassador Molari. John rose to his feet, turning to Londo. Although you and Ambassador Jakar were the initiators of the meeting, I, as the authorized representative of the Earth Commonwealth and also the chairman of the Presidium, am forced to take the floor first. As everyone present knows, no more than 8 hours ago, the Centauri Republic sent a fleet of warships to the Narn system. According to available information, some of them were armed with directed gravity acceleration installations, commonly called mass drivers, and used to conduct orbital bombardment of planets. I draw the attention of those present. Sheridan looked at the ambassadors with a grim look, returning again to the Centauri ambassador, that this type of weapon is recognized as prohibited by all states present.
Despite the fact, the captain shook his head, that the attack was unsuccessful, Thanks to the timely intervention of a representative of the Goa'uld Empire, many of the states present here, including Earth, Minbar, and Volan, have sent an official protest to the Centauri Republic. Ambassador Malari Londo. John sighed heavily. The Council awaits your comments. Captain Sheridan. The Centauri rose slowly. Esteemed members of the Council. Lord Bao. Malari bowed briefly to all the persons mentioned. The attack of the Centauri Republic ships on the planet Narn is an accomplished fact. There is no point in denying it. At the moment, as a representative of the Republic, I do not have the necessary information to comment on the situation. I have not yet received an answer to my request regarding the official position of the Emperor and the court.
Also, please note that the decision to send the fleet to the planet was made at the highest level, and I do not have information about the presence or absence of mass driver installations on board the ships. In this regard, I cannot take responsibility for any loud political statements until I receive instructions from my government.
Ambassador Malari cast a dark glance at Jakar and slowly sank back into his chair. It was obvious from the Centauri's expression that the ambassador was truly out of his element. He knew the Emperor had ordered the fleet to be sent. He knew the ships would have mass drivers. He had warned me about them. But then, after the ships had arrived in the Narn system and what had happened, he knew nothing. I don't know which ship Lord Refa had been on, but even if he had been on one of the two surviving vessels, they had clearly not yet made it home. And if they had, Londo had not been informed.
So the ambassador sat on the station, unsure of how to act or what to say. Do you have anything to add, Ambassador Jakar? Sheridan turned to the Narn, who sat with a strange expression on his face. Yes, Captain. The ambassador nodded and rose from his seat. The attack of the Centauri Republic on Narn was an expected move on the part of our enemy, which however does not cancel out the monstrous barbarity in the use of mass drivers on the cities of Narn. This time we were lucky, the man smiled, with the corner of his mouth, casting a quick glance at me. Thanks to the invaluable help of Lord Baal, who stood up to protect the peaceful population of my homeland, a catastrophe did not happen. I cannot know how everything will turn out next time, but I know one thing, Ambassador Malari. Jakar turned to Londo, looking him intently in the eyes. Even if next time you destroy my world to the ground, raining down on it every asteroid and bomb the Centauri have at their disposal, it will not change anything. We will never stoop to such barbarity as orbital bombardment of defenseless civilians, but rest assured, those who come to us with weapons will get their just deserts. A heavy silence fell over the council chamber. Jakar gave each of them a long, sullen look, as if to make sure everyone had heard and understood his words. But he stared into the eyes of the Centauri ambassador longer than anyone else. So long and so intently that Londo finally blinked, looking away from the man's red eyes. Chapter 51. Inquisition of Heresy. Things are rarely what they seem. In my personal experience, they are usually much worse. Inquisitor Titus Drake, Universe WH40, K. Interlude. Who was he? Where was he? Was he asleep? Dead? Alive? Had he ever existed? The questions came back to him one after another. Once, eons ago, he had known the answers to each of them. Once, but not now. Who was he? Trying to think about the question brought only a dull, aching pain, but nothing came to mind except the simple word, Sebastian. Was that a name? A calling? It seemed. Sometimes he was called the Inquisitor, but was that really true? Inquisitor was an old, very old word from Earth. Judge of the Inquisition, interrogator, punisher. How did he know that? His head was both frighteningly empty and cramped with a multitude of thoughts and knowledge. He had no idea who he was, where he was, what was happening, but at the same time he was clearly and distinctly aware that his name was Sebastian. He had slept for a long time, slept a sleep that was almost indistinguishable from death, and now, when he was awakened from sleep again, he was called for some purpose. A purpose for which he had been neither alive nor dead for several centuries. Century, a call,
awakening.
With each new word he remembered, with each new knowledge that emerged in his head, he felt more and more alive. Slowly the Inquisitor opened his eyes, looking around the place where he had once again become aware of himself. A dark, damp space, like a gloomy cave deep in the earth's depths. He was lying on something warm and soft, and for some reason this something seemed to him to be a large and calm beast. A living creature, not like himself, but undoubtedly possessing a complex mind, self-awareness, and personality. And he also felt movement. Sebastian turned his head to the side, discovering that right next to his bed on the floor lay a neatly folded pile of clothes. Extremely old, his memory told him that such a suit was worn several centuries ago, but ideal in its neatness and cleanliness. There, on the floor, lay a massive black cane with a strange knob, made of an unknown to him, translucent, yellowish crystalline material.
All this looked simultaneously familiar and alien, habitual and new, but he knew this time finally and clearly that he had a goal, and he would fulfill it, as he had done many times before. He would fulfill it because he must, because he took on a duty. With practiced movements, the man stood up and began to dress. Underwear, snow white and perfectly ironed, then trousers, a snow white shirt, a waistcoat, a black, perfectly tailored frock coat, a watch, cufflinks, a tie, gloves made of fine tanned leather. All the items of clothing, all the accessories were perfect. Exactly as, he now knew, he was accustomed to seeing them every time he opened his eyes during his next awakening. A black top hat completed the picture. Sebastian slightly bowed his head, and right in the air, obeying his fleeting thought, a silvery mirror plane thickened.
The Inquisitor glanced at his image, corrected minor flaws known only to him, picked up his cane and, with a calm, slightly arrogant look, leaned on it with his hands, closing his eyes. The details of his new goal appeared in his head. Delenn, the Minbari Federation ambassador to the Earth Commonwealth, Station Babylon 5, a loyal servant of the cause of light, sincerely believing in her destiny. Earth Commonwealth Captain John Sheridan, commander of the Babylon 5 station, a man who had proven himself a stubborn fighter against evil. Sebastian's lips curved into a wry smile. How many of them had been before, believing in their superiority, in the great mission. But this time something was different. No, his master's instructions regarding Delenn and Sheridan were clear and long known. A test of will and determination, a trial of humility. All that he was accustomed to and knew how to do better than others.
That with which he paid for his own sins, committed in the distant past. But there was something else. Someone. A tall humanoid. A human? No. Yes, outwardly, perhaps. But the information packet in Sebastian's head also contained doubts, uncertainty, and fear? No, not fear. Apprehension. Carefully hidden from the performer, the emotion of the owners still did not go unnoticed. He has been doing his job for too long, each time accumulating more and more experience and knowledge. Lord Bal. Who is he? One of the ancients, like the owners? A stranger from the unknown abysses of existence? An unknown variable in the familiar equation of the Great Labor. The Inquisitor frowned. Opening his eyes, he did not understand what exactly was behind the previously completely unimaginable emotion. He could not know the true background of what was happening, but somewhere, deep inside his self, into the darkness of which he had not dared to look for many years, his own monster raised its head. Raised it in order to feel an incomprehensible and unnatural fear? His gloved hand gripped the knob of his cane tighter. There were only a few hours left before arriving at Babylon 5. Londo Monari sat in his chair, looking rather gloomy, half-heartedly sipping a cup of mulled wine. Good wine, to be honest, but the ambassador's thoughts were far from pleasant pastimes at the moment. His head was much more occupied by the situation. Lord Dreyfus' failed plan for surprise and powerful attack on the Narn homeworld was in itself leading to very unpleasant consequences, and the fact that the Centauri fleet was planning to use a weapon banned in the galaxy during this attack And the situation was not saved by the fact that the second part of the planned battle went like clockwork. Mr.
Morden kindly confirmed that his employers would be happy to offer their services to resolve Ambassador Molari's small difficulty. And then Londo received confirmation from the reconnaissance ship that had arrived in the Gorash 7 system that the colony, as well as the entire military-industrial infrastructure, were in perfect order, but the Narn fleet was there too, scattered the slowly drifting debris across half the planetary system. Only Lord Refa himself, who was on board the Valerius, was missing, along with the Valerius itself and all the other ships sent to Narn. Londo used all available communication channels, official and otherwise, but he still 3 days after the attack had no idea about the fate of the 2 ships and his comrade. The only thing he managed to find out was the absence of the wreckage of the flagship in the Narn system itself.
And also a miraculous and with significant monetary infusions obtained recording of the Narn observation buoy, which clearly showed that 2 ships, including the Valerius, although they received significant damage, still managed to open the transition zone and go into hyperspace. 3 days. Londo! Virkota called out to the ambassador. Yes? The Centaurian's voice was filled with the doomed fatigue of a rational being who doesn't understand what to do next. Another response to your request has arrived from Centauri. The attaché looked down at the printed form. The location of the Centauri fleet flagship Valerius and Lord Refa is currently unknown. Thank you. The man nodded, finishing his wine and letting out a heavy sigh. London. What else, Vir? Molari looked up at his assistant standing over him. Maybe it's for the best? Well, if the attack had succeeded, the scandal would have been much louder. It would have been. The ambassador nodded.
I can hardly even predict the volume of the howl that would have been raised, but the war would have been over. Virrefa was right about that. After such a crushing blow, the Narns would have been afraid to even look in our direction for another 300 years. And now, the next moment, a call came through the embassy cabin's comm terminal on the government channel, the same one Londo had used to communicate with Lord Refa the last time. Molari blinked in surprise, exchanged glances with his assistant, touched the button to accept the call and stared at the screen even more surprised. Refa, are you alive? I wish the same for you, Molari. Pale and haggard, Refa nevertheless was, as they say, more alive than all the living. Well, Molari looked at the man thoughtfully, then raised an eyebrow skeptically. You look a bit unwell. I wouldn't like to start the conversation by saying that I warned you, but… The ambassador chuckled. I did warn you.
I warned you twice. Your sarcasm is out of place, Molari, the dignitary grimaced. This defeat will cost the Republic dearly. Oh, yes! Londo shook his head, feeling a dull irritation. Such a tangible blow to our reputation will not be forgotten for a long time. Not only did we openly get caught planning to use mass drivers on civilians, but we couldn't even cope with a defenseless planet. You know very well that there were Goa'uld there. You don't have to tell me about the Goa'uld, Refa. This defeat is entirely on your conscience, and you will have to clean up the consequences yourself. Rest assured, the man looked at his comrade with almost hatred. I will clean up, as you put it, these consequences. The main thing is not to make things worse. Lord Refa twitched his cheek but remained silent, and then for a few seconds, as if considering his next words, he nevertheless looked somewhere off-screen, shook his head and simply disconnected, leaving Molari with raised eyebrows in surprise, looking at the terminal's darkened screen. It seems you've angered him, Londo. It's okay. The ambassador waved his hand with some absent-mindedness in his voice. You'll calm down and then we'll talk. Although I'm already beginning to seriously think about how everything is going. Londo turned to his assistant. Not at all the way I'd like it to go. Somewhere I made a mistake. A big mistake. And I can only hope that it won't be the last. The results of the council meeting were strange. On the one hand, the Centaurians had independently and quite effectively dove into a pit of feces, especially in light of the failure of their brilliant plan to orbitally bombard the civilian population with asteroids, causing quite a public outcry both on Babylon and in the information field of the network.
And Jakar did not fail to take advantage of this.
I don't know whether on his own initiative or on the instructions of the government, having voiced the principled position of the Narns in time and stressed the unacceptability of such actions from their point of view. On the other hand, it was clear from the Narn's face, at least to me, that he still felt a little uneasy, since they had lost all the ships they had sent there at Gorash 7. Of course, that wasn't their entire fleet, but the slap in the face was still very, very painful. Then again, Shakar had no information about the fate of his uncle, who had commanded the ships sent there, which, given the growing nervousness of his request for his homeland, clearly could not leave the man in a calm state. But, in general, a lull reigned on all fronts of the confrontation.
According to the data I had from observation satellites in the Narn systems, they decided to make full use of the time to improve their own situation. All the warships in the reserve were urgently being brought out of mothballs. The few new ones that had not yet been launched at the beginning of the war were being completed, and Jakar was also busily engaged in purchasing weapons and resources from smugglers of all calibers that he could get his hands on. The only ones who remained completely visually inactive were the shadows. However, from their point of view, what was happening was not of particular interest yet. The conflict between Narn and Centauri had not gone away. They would definitely continue to fight. It was just that now, the emphasis of the success of the confrontation would shift from the Centauri Republic to the Narn Regime.
Although the replicator network estimated the direct intervention of our secretive friends at 68.2%, it was too early to judge definitively. They could still consider it more profitable to support a proven puppet than to replace him with a Narn, Babylon's sensors noted the arrival of a Vorlon transport ship at the station, a small living ship, almost identical to the one Ambassador Kosh had. Only Kosh had been on the station the entire time, with the exception of the Council, practically never leaving his cabin and trying hard not to catch my eye. Even there, the Vorlon demonstratively, as far as his spacesuit allowed, looked away in the case of the Vorlons. It was problematic even for the replicator sensors to determine the presence or absence of a passenger in the ship. The practically incorporeal representatives of the ancient species merged very well with their transport.
But in this case, a small module continuing to drift under the invisibility field near the station clearly saw there was another living creature inside the ship. A human. Curious. It could have been either Lyda Alexander, Kosh's pet telepath, or... I remember there was a certain Inquisitor in the series, a Vorlon watchdog kidnapped by them from Earth and called upon to conduct philosophical interrogations of intelligent beings that interested the Vorlons. How curious. However, considering how some individuals, for example Ambassador Delenn and Captain Sheridan, ran around as soon as the transport left hyperspace and headed for Babylon, it must have been the Inquisitor summoned by Kosh to check the reliability of their chosen ones. Yes, here comes our guest. Having connected to the Babylon cameras in the customs and transport area of the dock, I could perfectly observe Sheridan, with a strange expression on his face, waiting for the station's guest. Here the Vorlon ship docked, traditionally not met by a single worker of the transport service. Here an oval opening of a passage appeared in its hull, and from it, maintaining an expression of universal contempt and arrogant disgust on his face, came out a thin man, dressed in a suit from the times of Victorian England. A perfectly ironed and tailored black suit, a top hat, and a massive cane. The Inquisitor walked slowly and in complete silence, which made the steps echoing through the empty room and the ringing blows of the cane sound even more pathetic. Poser. Finally, the Vorlon messenger stepped into the light. He paused for a moment, looking thoughtfully at Sheridan, and then, with an even more displeased and contemptuous expression on his face, if that was even possible, he walked up to the captain, stopping a few steps away. I suppose they are waiting for me.
I think. Sheridan looked at the guest with a skeptical look, raised an eyebrow. You should introduce yourself and show your documents. Bravo. Perhaps it was my pernicious influence, but the captain answered his guest in the same tone, with exactly the same degree of warmth of attitude that was evident in the voice of the man standing before him. Sheridan might not have noticed it, but the analytical system of the replicators, complete with high-quality optics of Babylon 5, made it possible to understand perfectly how much titanic effort it cost the Inquisitor to maintain the same expression on his face, but the corner of his eye definitely twitched. Respect. I was warned about you.
The Volon envoy finally gave birth to the answer. "I'm here to do something. However, I'm here to do something. Emotions do not matter." The man sighed demonstratively, taking a folded piece of paper from his inside jacket pocket and handing it to the captain. "Take me to Ambassador Delian." "As soon as possible, then definitely." Sheridan nodded seriously, unfolded the document and began to read it carefully. Demonstratively attentive from the angle provided by the surveillance camera, it was impossible to make out the contents of the paper itself, but in those brief moments while the sheet was being passed from hand to hand, I was able to determine that with a high degree of probability, it was a standard form of a document confirming something like, "This intelligent being, so-and-so, is indeed an official representative and guest of the Vorlon Empire and was invited to Babylon 5 by Ambassador Kosh for business negotiations, blah blah blah." I suppose the captain himself knew perfectly well what exactly should be written in such a paper, but he chose to demonstratively play at bureaucracy, as they say, smile, it irritates everyone. "Are you kidding?" For a brief moment the man's composure failed him.
No way, my dear sir. Having finished reading the document, John folded the paper with a polite smile, gesturing for the guest to follow him. "Follow me." The captain headed to the nearest elevator where, having pressed the button for the desired floor, he leaned his back against the wall with an independent air, shamelessly looking at his companion. "Can you explain how you ended up on the Vorlon transport?" "I won't explain. I didn't know that the Vorlons had contact with humans outside of Babylon 5. Obviously, they didn't know. It was obvious from the Inquisitor's face that he had no desire to answer the station commander's questions, simply maintaining the dialogue at the level of giving an absolutely informative and truthful answer without answering anything substantively. "How long have you been away from Earth?" "Quite. Have you been to the Empire?" "Whose?" The man raised an eyebrow. "Vorlons." "Yes. Do you know what they look like?" Jean continued to interrogate his taciturn interlocutor. "Yes." "And?" "No and." The elevator doors opened and the Inquisitor simply walked forward down the corridor. "Wait a minute." Sheridan caught up with him, grabbing him by the sleeve. "I have no time." "But I want to know." "No." The man turned around sharply. "The truth? You are not ready to understand it. Facts? To save time, if you please. The Vorlons have been to Earth. The Vorlons have been everywhere, and they still are. My name is Sebastian. I was born and lived in London, on Earth." The Inquisitor spoke quickly, like a memorized monologue, not giving Sheridan even a word to get in his speech. "On Hursford Lane, 14B, in 1888. The Vorlons found me, took me from Earth, and took me into their service. I learned everything about everything, Captain Sheridan, and the scales fell from my eyes. I saw the greatness and horror of the universe." Sebastian looked at the captain as if he were an unreasonable child to whom he was forced to explain self-evident truths. "I am called when I am needed and kept the rest of the time. I am a tool, Captain, a ruthless and objective tool. So, either let me do my job, or I'll leave you. Either way, this pointless conversation is over." Funny. While speaking in this contemptuously proud manner, Sebastian looked more like he was both incredibly irritated and entertained by this situation. Perhaps it would be worth sending Behemoth into one of the neighboring corridors, so that the tailed telepath could monitor what was happening without giving any indication of his presence. "He won't even notice that I'm at this station," came a smug transmission from the G-rings. It is unknown what exactly the Vorlons did to him. He may well be a telepath, so... "I understand." The hippopotamus switched off, and exactly 2 seconds later, I recorded a request to use the teleportation module which transferred the cat to one of the nooks a little ahead along the pair's path. Sebastian slightly jerked his head in the direction of the energy surge, but his face showed no emotion, and he pretended that nothing was happening. Extremely curious. If the Vorlons had changed his physiology, and they did in any case, then using a simple mortal without upgrades in such important matters made no sense. He could well have received additional senses. The captain, meanwhile, was clearly struggling with the urge to slam Sebastian's head into the bulkhead, but the man's professionalism and diplomatic qualities, nurtured by his interactions with ambassadors on Babylon 5, won out. And John merely nodded, maintaining a stony expression and gesturing for his guest to follow him. They continued their journey in silence,
until Sheridan finally led Sebastian into a separate room, originally intended as a warehouse, but now empty. After looking around the space allocated for the test, the Inquisitor nodded indulgently. "Invite Ambassador Delenn to see me, Captain. I would not like to waste time." And then something absolutely incredible happened. As soon as John went out the door, Sebastian hit the floor with his cane, causing the knob to flare up with a golden glow for a moment, and I went blind? Well, I mean, all the station surveillance systems located in the room and in the corridors at some distance from the man completely failed. Now they transmitted only interference and nothing else, while continuing to report to the station central computer that they were fully operational. Moreover, the effect partially affected the replicator sensors, although not in all available observation spectra.
I was already extremely interested in getting to know our guest and the technologies available to him better.
Interlude. The one you've been waiting for has arrived, Delenn. He's waiting for you in a separate room in Sector 19. The Minbari ambassador took a deep breath, pausing for a moment before the door Sheridan had indicated. Sector 19, the storage area, currently empty. Empty corridors on the way here. Having exited the elevator at the right level, she had not encountered a single human or alien, as if the station had suddenly become deserted. The only living being of the Jirings, as Lord Baal called it, was a huge black telepathic cat named Behemoth. The cat followed the woman with a close and very attentive gaze, walked next to her for some time and stopped only when she had already turned directly to the closed hatch of the sector. As paradoxical as it may sound, the woman was ready to swear that in the animal's gaze one could read not at all animal curiosity and sympathy. Shaking her head, the ambassador dispersed extraneous thoughts. Now she needed to focus on the matter. Everything else could wait. Almost silently, the double hatch to the sector opened as the Minbari woman extended her hand. Allowing herself to pause as if in indecision for exactly one more moment, Delenn took a step forward. It was indeed an ordinary warehouse, of which there were many throughout Babylon 5, currently empty. A large, dimly lit room with a smooth metal floor and bare metal walls. "Stay here," a cold voice from the darkness, which sounded as soon as the woman walked closer to the center of the room. Freezing under one of the lamps in a circle of light made her shudder. "Put it on." Two strange-looking metal bracelets slid across the floor to the Minbari's feet. Bending down, the woman carefully touched them, heavy, cold, but, to her surprise, they were quite loose, and if she didn't apply any force, they would simply fall off her hands.
"These are your shackles," the voice said again. "They are yours. As you can see, they are loose enough that you can throw them off at any time, if you so desire. But by doing so, you admit your defeat before the Vorlons and your unsuitability for their mission. Do you understand?"
"Yes," the woman said quietly.
"Then we will begin." There were loud metallic blows in the room, and a tall, thin man, a human, in a dark suit, the kind Delenn had probably only seen in historical chronicles dedicated to Earth's past, emerged from the darkness into the light.
"Who are you?"
I'm Delenn," the Minbari answered in surprise.
"Unacceptable," the voice of the Vorlon messenger lashed out. "The answer is not relevant. I know your name very well. Who are you?"
"Delenn."
She barely had time to finish speaking when the man slammed his cane onto the floor, and a sharp pain cut through the Minbari's entire body, as if thousands of needles had simultaneously pierced her skin, causing her to cry out in surprise. As suddenly as it had appeared, the pain disappeared, leaving no trace of itself. "There is a punishment for an unacceptable answer," the Inquisitor explained to the woman, as if she were a small child. "Who are you?" Delenn frantically tried to figure out what answer was required of her. "I am the Minbari ambassador." "Unacceptable. This is a formal rank, what you are called when you wish to hide behind titles." "Who are you?" The man raised his voice. I am the daughter." "Unacceptable." Another blow of the cane on the floor, and another flash of pain, this time a little longer. "Regrettable." The Inquisitor shook his head. "You're not capable of answering such a simple question without resorting to genealogy, clichés, social constructs. Are you nothing in yourself? There is nothing in you except for the superficial words said by others? How, then,
The Vorlon envoy walking around, the woman stopped, looking intently into her eyes. Are you going to fight for others, having no idea even of what you yourself are? Do you know how many intelligent people stood before me before you? Proud, arrogant, full of faith in their own importance, certain that they were the chosen ones. Special, believing that they were blessed by God. And they all broke. The man spoke ingratiatingly, bringing his face close to the lens. And it serves them right. There is no need to confuse those who trusted them with empty hopes. And so you. The woman turned her head to the side, but was forced to look at the Inquisitor again when he turned her forcibly with the top of his cane. You had the audacity to ascribe to yourself a divine mission. Faith in your own destiny. I don't believe. And today, before I leave this place, the man smiled, you too will lose faith, or die. Either outcome will be fine with me. Why do you need to kill me? Having overcome her anxiety, the Minbari found the strength to ask, kill? Oh no, I do not intend to kill you. You are completely free to remove your shackles and leave, but... The Inquisitor raised his finger. This would mean admitting your error, admitting that you are unworthy or weak for the upcoming mission. And we will see if you can humble your ego, or if your pride will not allow you to retreat even in the face of death. You can stay. He spread his hands, hoping that the universe will save you, you, the chosen one. But you can also be wrong in your faith. Here and now, we will find out. Once and for all. So, who are you? Captain? Sheridan Ivanov called out. Is everything all right?
The man had been sitting deep in thought at one of the terminals in the station's control room for half an hour now. The Vorlon envoy who had arrived on Babylon had been troubling him. Something was wrong with this Sebastian. John wasn't entirely sure that this was his real name, but something in his appearance, his manners, and the general impression the man left on him had been troubling the captain. He had seen it somewhere, read about something like this, about someone. The Inquisitor's expression, the way he looked at the station's ordinary residents as they passed by the entertainment venues. Captain? The commander called out to him again. Ah, yes, Ivanova. Sheridan blinked and shook his head. Everything is fine, except... Yes? Do we have materials on the history of the Earth? It seems that the station's database should have recorded... I think so. The woman nodded and sat down at the neighboring terminal. What are we looking for?
England? John began thoughtfully. 19th century, London. Try to find one name. Yes, I am ready to make a request. Kevin entered the necessary section of the database. Ivanova nodded, turned into the captain. Sebastian. Must have been living at 14B Harsford Lane around 1888. There may be references earlier, but not later than that date. Ahem, the commander coughed in surprise. What demands you have, Captain, but we'll try to find it. For a while, the cabin was silent, broken only by the clicking of keys. It took Commander Ivanov almost half an hour to narrow down the results list enough to be workable, without any data other than a name and a probable residential address. Information in the database that was so old could not boast of reliability and unambiguity. So, what's there? Sighing, Sheridan stood up from his seat, approaching Ivanova. Did you manage to find anything? I think so, sir. But 3 fit the parameters of the request. 3?
John raised an eyebrow in surprise.
Sebastian Muron lived at this address until January 1888. The last mention is recorded in the records of the local police station. He was shot while trying to escape during his arrest. Clearly not our case. Then, here it is. Ivanova closed the file, moving on to the next one. Walter Sickert, a British artist. In 1880, he changed his name to Sebastian and almost completely disappeared from public view. Famous for his painting Jack the Ripper's bedroom.
He died in 1942. The documents indicate the same address. Jack the Ripper. Sheridan tapped his finger on his lips. It reminded him of something.
For some time he worked in London hospitals. After several years, he started his own practice and switched to alternative methods of treatment.
Funny. Returning to Jack the Ripper, it was Tumblety who was suspected of this series of murders, judging by the fact that Ivanova checked the footnote to the document. His name appears as a suspect in the same case that was opened against the maniac. In November 1888, he was arrested, but due to the lack of witnesses, he was released on bail. Then the trail goes cold. There is not a single mention of him in England, the USA, or any other country. And he just happened to live in house 14B. In the database there is a short note from the landlord about personal belongings left behind. It was as if he had vanished. Vanished. Sheridan ran his eyes over the scant lines of search results displayed on the display, trying hard to catch the elusive thought. Wait a minute.
If oblenjawa jest osinas komora nie z personal fila, theoretically,
I'll check now. Ivanova dug around in the database for a while. Yes, there is a photo, though in disgusting quality. Oh shit, John exhaled, looking at the display. The photograph was indeed a disgusting quality, black and white, clearly damaged by time and storage conditions before it was digitized, but a completely recognizable person was looking at him from the screen. That same Inquisitor, Sebastian, the Volon envoy called to check on Delaine, according to his own words, kidnapped by the Volons in 1888 from Earth, Jack the Ripper. What? Susan turned around. It's him. Who? Jack the Ripper, the very same one. A passenger on the arriving Volon transport. What? The commander blinked in surprise. But how? Ambassador Delaine is there. Sheridan turned on his heels, running from the bridge, calling Michael Garibaldi on the communicator as he went.
he didn't give a damn about any and all lofty tests dreamed up by Ambassador Kosh. He didn't give a damn about any and all higher goals. This was a diplomatic station, and he was responsible for the safety of all its inhabitants, and especially and in particular the ambassadors of other states, one of whom was now in an empty warehouse in the 19th sector, one-on-one with the most famous serial maniac and killer of the 19th century. Garibaldi reacted as always, promptly. Sheridan had just jumped into the elevator, sending it to the required level, when one level below, the doors opened and the head of security quickly entered the cabin, accompanied by two of his subordinates. All three security guards were armed, and Garibaldi himself, without saying a word, handed John another blaster, obviously grabbed from the armory. "What's the plan?" He turned to the man. "If I'm wrong, I'll make a formal apology," Sheridan grumbled, checking the gas capsule that served as a magazine. "If not, I don't care whose messenger he is. I won't allow any more chaos on Babylon 5. "Got it," Michael shrugged philosophically. "So first we ask questions and then we shoot." "Captain Sheridan, Mr. Garibaldi." The elevator stopped at another intermediate level and the passengers saw the Minbari ambassador's attaché, Lanier, looking very worried and out of breath. "Thank Valen that I ran into you. I was looking for you. Mr. Lanier?" Sheridan stepped aside, letting the Minbari into the cockpit. "Unless your matter is critically urgent, it's a matter of life and death. You must influence Kosh, the Vorlon envoy. Lanier tried to catch his breath, but was forced to talk and talk in order to convey the information to his interlocutor. "The Inquisitor, it seems he—" "We know, Mr. Lanier," John stopped him. "We are on our way there right now to solve this problem." "Thank you," the attaché exhaled. "Praise be to Valen." The pain was so intense that Delaine couldn't even scream. Her throat simply refused to push out even a single sound. She couldn't slip into unconsciousness either. An unknown force wouldn't even let her fall, bending and slightly lifting her off the floor. The Inquisitor, the Vorlon emissary, stood with an unreadable expression on his face, holding a cane with a brightly shining knob in his hands, and his eyes were fixed on the woman being tortured now. Finally, deciding that it was enough for now, the man lowered his cane, slamming it loudly onto the floor, and Delaine instantly felt herself falling. The woman didn't even notice the impact with the metal floor, glad for even a short respite and feeling how slowly, as if reluctantly, The pain that had tormented every cell of her body just a moment ago was leaving. Only now, along with a hoarse exhalation, a groan sounded from the Minbari's lips. "I'm afraid nothing good awaits you." Sebastian squatted down next to the ambassador, looking her over. "However, you are not to blame for anything." He shook his head. "Your fate was determined long ago, and you will not be able to change anything. Like the others, you are doomed from the moment of birth. It's not up to you to decide." A voice behind him made Sebastian shut up and smoothly rise to his feet, turning around. "And here is the last character of our drama." The smile on the Inquisitor's face faded slightly, and he himself looked with surprise at the delegation of Captain Sheridan, Garibaldi with 2 security guards, each of whom pointed a weapon at him, and the attaché of the Minbari ambassador who entered the room. "And why do you think that I have no right to decide, Captain? Because your trial is nothing more than a cruel farce, Inquisitor." "An indulgence of your own base impulses," John said, grimacing but not losing his guard. "Or perhaps you are more accustomed to the name Sebastian Tumblety." "Oh," Sebastian grinned. "Let me congratulate you. You did an excellent job on your ancient history homework. Leave Ambassador Delaine alone." "Why?" The man raised an eyebrow. "Just leave it. What is she to you?" "I am not obliged to answer your questions." As he spoke, the captain walked around the Vorlon envoy in a wide arc, trying to avoid blocking the view of his companions, who continued to keep Sebastian in their sights, and trying to get closer to Delaine, who was moving weakly on the floor. "Captain," Garibaldi managed to exclaim warningly, literally sensing the approaching problems in his gut, and the next moment... The Inquisitor took a short step to the side, moving away, albeit for a moment, from the point of fire, and sharply struck the floor with his cane, emitting a blinding wave of light, a dense circle that struck in all directions from him, knocking those present off their feet, and throwing Sheridan completely against the nearest wall, noticeably slamming his back against the beam. Meow. What the man wanted to do next remained unknown. The disgruntled cat's meow that resounded in the silence that had settled in made Sebastian shudder and turn towards the sound, his eyes widening in surprise as he looked at Behemoth, who was languidly entering the room. And that was the last thing he did of his own free will, freezing like a stone statue under the Jerinx's watchful gaze. "Oh, what was that?" Garibaldi slowly rose from the floor with a groan, shaking his head from side to side. It felt as if a mare had kicked him in the chest. "What the... Captain?" The head of security's gaze fell on the Inquisitor, frozen in his previous pose, and then slowly, and as if with apprehension, moved to the large black cat sitting on the floor, now wagging both tails in obvious displeasure. Garibaldi blinked in bewilderment. "I'm fine, Michael." Picking up the blaster that had fallen in flight, Sheridan looked around the scene that had opened up to him with the same bewildered gaze, but then, realizing it, he rushed to the Minbari woman who was still lying there. "Ambassador! Delaine! Captain! John!" The woman tried to rise with a groan. "What are you—" "Quiet! I came to help! Lanier told me what's going on here." "Oh, I'm okay." Delaine was finally able to sit up, leaning on the man's outstretched hand. "Captain." Garibaldi took aim at the man frozen in the middle of the room again, carefully walked around him in an arc and approached the couple. "And what are we going to do with him? And how? What is Behemoth doing here?" "What the hell is going on?" "I'll tell you later. It's just that this is Lord Ball's cat. I understand everything. No need to explain anything." Raising his eyebrows, Michael demonstratively stepped back. "I'm joking, of course, and I should, but I understand. I'll wait." "And with our guest," the captain sighed, rising to his feet and walking around Sebastian. "We'll deal with him now." Sheridan took aim and with a strong kick knocked the Inquisitor's cane out of his hands, rolling across the floor with a wooden sound to the side. Having made sure that the man was still motionless, John approached the Jerinx, who continued to glare at his opponent, and, squatting down next to him, began hesitantly. "Behemoth, Sheridan looked from the cat to Sebastian and back. "Could you let him go so we can talk?" "I hope," the captain sighed, "that without his cane he won't do anything." Jerinx purred, twitched his ear, and looked away from the Vorlon envoy, turning his gaze to Sheridan. The next moment, Sebastian twitched, convulsively clenching his fingers, but the cane was not in his hands, and he froze, shifting his gaze between those present, his cheek twitching in annoyance. "What are you doing, Captain? What kind of creature is this?" Returning his arrogant expression, Sebastian took a step back from Behemoth, turning to the man. "Do I allow myself? It was you who staged this cruel farce.
What kind of medieval torture is this? John, Delenn spoke up. This is a test, Ambassador Kosh. Ambassador Kosh can go to hell, Sheridan turned to the woman. This is a diplomatic station of the Earth Commonwealth, and what is happening cannot be perceived as anything other than an attack on the ambassador. And this is entirely a matter of my jurisdiction. You don't understand. However, what else could I expect from someone like you, Captain?
What I did not do on my own whim. I have already told you, I am an instrument, called upon to fulfill the mission assigned to me, to find out the answer to a simple question. Will Ambassador Delenn pass some kind of test? Exactly, the Inquisitor answered, with a wry smile. And by your actions you… Oh no, it is you, esteemed Sebastian Tumblety, who are violating international treaties and laws with your actions, John interrupted him. The attack on the officers of Babylon 5 in the person of me and Mr. Garibaldi, the attack on the representative of the Minbari embassy in the person of Mr. Lanier. The Minbari, who had already regained his composure and his usual calm appearance, nodded solemnly. Physical violence and the threat to kill the Minbari ambassador. Do you even realize what situation you are in now? John, I will not file a complaint for assault. Delenn spoke up after a short silence. I agreed to the test voluntarily.
Ambassador Kosh must make sure that… If Ambassador Kosh wants to be sure of something, the captain cut the woman off harshly. Let him be kind enough to ask the question in person and resolve all doubts. Or there. John waved his hand towards the wall. Let him sweep off to the neighboring star system and do whatever he pleases there. But not on Babylon 5. Understand, Delenn? Sheridan sighed, calming down. This is not a test. Not a check or a test. This is the fulfillment of the perverted desires of one specific serial killer from ancient times. He pointed his finger at Sebastian, who smiled crookedly. If these are the methods of the light, the man made quotation marks with his fingers. Such light does not suit me. It seems I am the only one who doesn't understand something here, Garibaldi said thoughtfully, exchanging glances with his subordinates. However, no, you guys clearly don't know either.
The man shrugged, leaning his back against the wall with an unperturbed expression, but continuing to hold the blaster at the ready, closely monitoring the Inquisitor's slightest movements. Philosophy is philosophy, but healthy paranoia has not been cancelled. Your arrogance. Enough. Ambassador Kosh, as always, approached silently and, it seemed, had been standing in the passage for some time, observing the situation. The test is over. Ambassador Kosh? Delenn looked at the Volon in surprise. Captain Sheridan came from the vocabulator of the ambassador's suit, turning his head towards John. I apologize for what happened. Misunderstandings. They are not good for the common cause. Will we come to an agreement? Kosh's eye narrowed to a point, continuing to drill Sheridan with his gaze. Ambassador Kosh, Sheridan nodded to the Volon, breaking the prolonged puzzled silence. If Ambassador Delenn does not press charges. And if her health has not been harmed. I'm fine, John. The Minbari straightened up next to the captain, carefully placing her hand on his elbow, although to tell the truth, she still didn't feel too well. In that case, the captain twitched his cheek, maintaining a polite expression, with an incredible effort of will. I believe this incident can be hushed up, but Sebastian must leave the station immediately. Yes. Kosh nodded smoothly with his suit helmet, glanced briefly at the Inquisitor, and without saying another word, turned around and left the room. Sebastian, without saying a word, bowed silently to the captain, picked up his cane from the floor, and straightening his suit, walked leisurely after the Vorlon. Captain? Are we just going to let him go? Garibaldi saw off the departing man. This time, yes, Michael. Thanks for your help. It's your business, Captain. The head of security sighed and shrugged, putting the blaster back in its holster.
The Vorlon Empire transport ship smoothly left the dock of Babylon 5, heading for the local transition zone. The station dispatcher issued clearance for departure, recorded the ship's departure and simply sighed with relief, having gotten rid of the problematic guest. No, there was nothing special in the fact of the presence or absence of Vorlon ships on the station. The ships were small, did not require any maintenance, or rather they directly and categorically forbade outsiders from approaching them, and they moved around the station's unloading zones independently, carefully following all existing protocols and regulations.
Only they were living creatures, not technology created by someone's hands. Can you imagine what a living organism is? 150 meters long and armed with weapons capable of giving some cruisers a run for their money. That's it.
It's better to keep your ears open with such creatures and try to simply avoid crossing paths for as long as possible. The terminal beeped with a request to activate the station's jump zone, and the dispatcher gave the go-ahead with relief, glancing briefly at the observation window, where a bright spark of energy flashed inside the distant jump zone structure, then expanded into a glowing funnel. The Vorlon ship left Babylon 5 space. As soon as the transition funnel collapsed, cutting off the passage between degenerate space and ordinary space, a multitude of dark purple clouds flared up in the midst of the crimson-black shimmers of hyperspace, from which a whole swarm of small flying machines emerged, surrounding the ship. The Vorlon transport froze for a moment, as if in indecision, and then tried to accelerate sharply, breaking out of the encirclement. To ram one of the machines, to do at least something, but
The objects lined up in a regular grid structure, enclosing the living vessel in a perfect sphere. Thin beams of energy stretched between them, glowing brightly against the gloomy surroundings. And then the beams turned into bluish glowing planes of force fields, completely cutting off the ship from the surrounding space. Not allowing the Vorlon transport to do anything else, a huge golden pyramid emerged from the same purple cloud, hooked the sphere drifting in hyperspace with the caught prey with a gravitational grip, and, pulling it inside the hole that opened on the hull, at the same moment went into a hyperspace jump again. A purple flash, a short moment of acceleration, and only the endless black-crimson shimmers of degenerate space remained. Chapter 52. Does this platform have a soul? Intelligence is a disgusting thing. A person without a brain is absolutely confident in the high level of his development.
a smart person is well aware of what an idiot he is, in essence. From the internet. Well, hello there, my friend. The Vorlon transport ship jerked once again, trying to break free from the cocoon of the force field. Unlike the shadows, it was clearly not capable of leaking into hyperspace or phasing, as their foot soldiers did. Another difference was that the ship, although it had telepathy, which I assume was used to improve communication with the Vorlon pilot, was not constantly connected into something like a collective consciousness. At least, the specially grown brain scanner on duty near the test subject recorded only one psi-pulse, and that was undirected and faded out without even leaving the boundaries of the star system. A thorough and detailed scan of the ship's hull, conducted by the juniors using all the methods available to the replicators, yielded significantly more information than using the Babylon 5 sensors, albeit with the addition of replicator blocks.
The Vorlon transport was complex and in its own way beautiful. A living organism, I believe, grown artificially or adapted from some previously existing life form suitable for living in vacuum conditions. Most of the body of the ship was occupied by the body of the transport area, which is also the passenger compartment. The pilot's cabin and all that other stuff could essentially be considered something between a stomach and a pocket, like in Earth marsupials. At its own request, or rather at the pilot's command, the ship could open this area outward, letting in or letting out a passenger. It was hard to say how this was with the Vorlon pilot, due to the lack of a Vorlon for experiments, but I suppose he could leak into the ship on his own. After all, for Ambassador Cautious relatives, the body was a somewhat conditional phenomenon.
Unlike the materials that made up the hull of the shadow ships, the Vorlons were more like living skin. A dense and flexible structure consisting of many intricately arranged layers, something that really resembled ordinary epidermis, only adapted to a much more aggressive environment than life on a planet. And here, everything coincided with my memories of what was said in the series. The ship's hull was designed to absorb energy coming from outside, digesting 82.32% of its volume within the safety margin. In fact, this meant an extremely high level of protection against pulse weapons of younger races, as in the case of the White Stars. The energy component of the charge that hit the ship was almost completely absorbed by the hull, and the remaining kinetic part simply dented the skin, leaving a bruise, which, however, could well heal over time.
The ship's mind was also curious. Unlike the shadows, which used the pilot's brain for this purpose, integrated into the ship's hull as a part of it, the Vorlon transport was intelligent in itself. According to the replicator's estimates, the ship's intelligence level was approximately equal to the mind of a very smart monkey if compared to an ordinary person. That is, it would not be possible to have abstruse philosophical conversations with it, but it was quite possible to convey some simple thought like, "Yours unload the passenger, mine don't dissect you alive right now." Having been inspired by the generous offer, the transport spat out an iridescent cocoon of Sebastian, packed in stasis, who was immediately picked up by a teleport beam and transferred to a neighboring laboratory box. A new round of thorough scanning and new data obtained. The Inquisitor was a human, once.
No. Now he was still a human. Only, according to the scanning results, his DNA contained 43.76% foreign elements not inherent in the Homo sapiens genome. From the point of view of existing technologies available to Earthlings, and perhaps other younger races, changing the genetic structure of an adult-formed organism without turning it into a puddle of organic slime or a mutant with an appearance in the best traditions of a John Carpenter film was at the level of a miracle. The same replicators, of course, had full knowledge of the genetic construction of Asgard, but the little gray men preferred, knew how, and practiced the approach of easier to assemble from scratch and as needed, without making such radical changes to a living organism. But the Vorlons deigned to do it.
However, there was always the option that this Sebastian was no longer the same Sebastian that the Vorlons took from Earth in the 19th century, but was his exact visual copy, grown using genetic engineering with the subsequent transfer of the original's memories. But why so complicated? The messenger's main working tool deserved special attention, a massive wood-like cane with a crystal knob. In fact, it was a cane to the same extent as a Kalashnikov assault rifle, which, if necessary, could also be used for support. Having photographed the exact structure of the object with a teleportation device, I could say with confidence that it was a high-tech and rather complex device, built on principles very much reminiscent of techno-magic implants producing shadows. Inside the cane, there was also a module responsible for forming a channel into the zero space, but the mechanism of its operation was still somewhat different.
Shadow Technomagic worked perfectly for any user who had the necessary device, implant. In fact, the implant itself did all the work, requiring from the magician only an idea of the effect that needed to be obtained at the output. If, of course, the effect was at least theoretically possible from the point of view of the laws of the universe. The cane was a more narrowly focused tool, having a limited range of functions, moreover requiring the presence of a telepathic gene in its operator. However, the device itself, although it was not something outstanding, still added new details to the information already known to the replicators on the existing technology. And this is the most important reason why it was worth starting all this research at all. In addition, it was a new example of organic technology, using materials and methods similar to the capabilities of replicators, albeit limited by the capabilities of organic matter as such.
This was still not enough to think about changing the structural basis of one's self, but if only I knew what this self of mine was. It's funny to think, but despite all the time that had passed, despite all my actions, decisions and plans that had happened and developed since I appeared in this world, I had no idea who I was. Replicator 3 with a radically changed personality matrix and an unknown memory of an Earth TV series from the 90s of the 20th century which, as far as I remembered, did not exist in the original universe of this body. The soul of some unknown to me inhabitant of Earth from that very 20th century, who somehow ended up in the body of a humanoid replicator, who in turn ended up in the universe of the Babylon 5 TV series. Hell, I might as well have been a new form of inorganic life that had just happened to emerge on the Earth Commonwealth's Babylon 5 station and had gained knowledge of the possible future of that world,
complete with ideas about a bunch of different technological solutions that I think were inherent in replicators from what I think was a completely different universe, which I think was described in its own science fiction series. A booming sound of metal hitting metal echoed through the cabin of the Gold Empire ambassador, and another, and a third.
Feeling that this was not something that brought no relief but had no consequences at all except for dents on the surface, I nevertheless stopped banging my forehead against the tabletop, although, by all the existing gods, I would have liked otherwise. In general, the question that so suddenly puzzled me was truly important, especially in the context of the fact that I had not asked myself about it for almost 2 years of my stay here. What could have caused such abrupt changes? The accumulated errors in the code that Coronet tried to detect with enviable consistency, or the development of a personal matrix, similar to the full awareness of oneself by the sisters, which had moved to some other higher level of organization? I had no answer. Just as I had no idea who could give me this answer. Certainly not the Vorlons with the shadows. Perhaps Lorien could have said something smart, after all. The old man was the first living being in this universe, and should have seen an indecently large amount. True, this is provided that he exists here, and just like in the series, he sits in the depths of Zadum and did not bolt from the galaxy, like the other grown-up primordials, although perhaps it is worth starting with someone simpler, for example, with the Soul Hunters. As far as I remembered, these comrades were able, or at least pretended, to be able to work with such a subtle matter as the souls of intelligent beings. And as for me, if you know how to intercept such a substance at the moment of death and enclose it in something material for the purpose of long-term storage, you should understand what and how you are doing. The only problem was that I had no idea where the hunters lived in the original story. This question was not covered at all. In all the events shown, the Soul Hunters appeared a handful of times, and their home world was never shown. Only once was some abandoned planet indicated, discovered by earthly archaeologists' gravediggers, which later turned out to be some kind of burial ground or warehouse with souls preserved there. Like in a collection, but I had a great machine. According to the information in the replicator network, the machine's design was 91.452% complete, which already allowed its functionality to be used almost in full. The successfully trained operator took his rightful place in the control center of the design, and I began to search.
The Great Machines module, designed for telepathic communication over super long distances or searching for the required intelligent beings at the same distance, left a curious impression. As expected from all the experiments modeled by the younger ones, the presence of consciousness with at least the smallest rudiments of telepathic abilities, at the level of having a telepathic gene in principle, was enough for the device to do everything else. Having connected to the machine through the communication module with the replicator network implanted in the brain, using it as an organic HMI, I listened to the cosmos.
The database of the original machine, long since copied by the replicators, contained information about the very existence of the Soul Hunters, but it seemed that these comrades were very secretive. The note was limited to a list of systems in which their presence was noted in the past. Recorded facts of intersection with representatives of other races of the galaxy and fragmentary data on their biology, ship parameters, and socio-cultural structure. Now, using the long-distance communication module for subscriber search, I felt like Charles Xavier, who put on the Cerebro helmet through the implant into the network of replicators a stream of images containing information about the mind casts of all intelligent beings in the area of action of the device.
Even in the case of the original device, this area was quite large, covering with a reserve of 15.34% the entire part of the galaxy inhabited by local inhabitants, and in the performance of the replicators according to the habit instilled in them, they brought all technological units accessible to their understanding to the ideal. Realizing the principles of operation of this device, you involuntarily begin to think that the teachings of the same Jedi about the Force would not be such nonsense here as it may seem. The idea was that all forms of intelligent life in the universe, according to the idea of the creators of the Great Machine, were connected to each other, even if they were not aware of each other's existence, and were generally located at opposite ends of the galaxy.
Ivanova, in the original story, I remember, saw this process somewhat differently. Probably due to the limitations imposed by the organic human brain, but in my case, through the much more advanced brain in a jar, a scattering of bright shining multicolored stars appeared before my eyes. These were not stars in the literal sense, but each of them represented groups of minds of representatives of the same species, powerful enough in their totality to shine across the abysses of space. A silvery white shimmering star, estimating its position relative to the galaxy map, one could assume that it was the Vorlon Empire. In the same way, my analogy, one could also recognize the shadows, a dense red star noticeably brighter than the first,
which is not surprising, because the overwhelming majority of the inhabitants of this species were sitting on Zahadum.
And yes, Lorien was located, it seemed. That was where I had to look at the shadows more closely for a moment. Another point became noticeable against the background of their mental glow. Very small, but in brightness no less than their entire civilization. However, I was not looking for them at all. Carrying out the given command, the network of replicators filtered out unnecessary signals through the machine and, well, the point determined by the system as a concentration of the minds of the soul hunters was dim and barely noticeable, at least against the background of some of the other stars. The originals were gathered in one star system on the very outskirts of the galaxy. In fact, a little more, and they could be classified as nomads. At least the double star, located at the very end of the sleeve, in my opinion, was holding on there, on its word of honor. Well, or thanks to the technological tricks of highly developed aliens. Well.
Now, perhaps, we can fly over and get acquainted. Interlude. Captain Sheridan watched the Pakmara and Drazi delegations leave his office with a thoughtful and extremely concerned look. However, exactly the same emotions were easily read on the face of Commander Ivanova, who stood next to the commander of Babylon 5. The previous wave of scandal about the attempted attack of the Centauri on Narn using prohibited weapons had barely died down when the Republic distinguished itself once again. According to the ambassadors, it turned out that having failed in the planned blitzkrieg, Londo's relatives decided to protect themselves from possible aggression from their neighbors. At least Sheridan could not explain the news he received with anything else, even remotely suitable as a reasonable pretext. Centauri ships carried out a series of attacks on the border worlds of the Drazi and Pakmara, located directly along their common borders.
It seems the Centaurians have finally gone crazy, Ivanova sighed. Considering what we know, the captain raised an eyebrow meaningfully. I'm not sure they had much of a choice. You're right. Maybe you should talk to him? With Londo, I mean. We have no reason not to trust the Drazi or the Pakmara, but what's happening still seems a bit weird. Londo hasn't been seen in public since the last meeting. Sheridan tapped the table thoughtfully. But you're right. I'll call him in for a talk. After all, a clear understanding of the situation by all interested parties is in his interests as well. Prepare a report to Earth? Yes, the captain nodded. They should know about the situation in any case. Prepare it after the conversation with the ambassador. I will add if there is anything, and send it. I will do it. Commander Ivanova turned on her heels and left the office, and Sheridan leaned back in his chair. It really did look like a theater of the absurd. Trying to justify and understand the Centauri government's decision to attack its neighbors without finally resolving the issue with the Nars alone seemed so idiotic that the captain sometimes thought everything that was happening was some kind of stupid joke. However, John corrected himself. One shouldn't forget about the influence of the shadows, as Delenn had said. They needed a conflict, and this fact fit perfectly into the existing picture of an attack on everyone in a row, and the probability, albeit tiny, that the next target could be the Earth Commonwealth did not add to the man's optimism. Being honest with himself, the Babylon commander still did not consider such an outcome very likely. Contacting Earth or Mimbar while fighting the League members and the Narn was tantamount to suicide. Even with the direct participation of the Shadows in the fighting, this would only lead to Vorlon intervention and a full-scale galactic dump. There was no time for development through struggle here. Sheridan winced. Vorlon. After leaving the Inquisitor's station, Ambassador Kosh had done his best to pretend that he, Sheridan, did not exist in nature. At least, over the past couple of days, they had encountered only 3 times. Each time, the alien had simply passed by, clearly not intending to discuss or comment on what had happened. Delenn, however, as she had said then, did not file a protest or accuse anyone of attacking the ambassador, limiting herself to a visit to Dr. Franklin, who officially confirmed the absence of any dangerous consequences from Sebastian's actions and prescribed the woman a couple of days of rest with abundant food. Sheridan could only shake his head. Sighing, the captain sat up straighter in his chair, moving closer to the table. Thoughts were good, but he still needed to talk to Londo. Having entered a couple of commands into the terminal, Sheridan sent Molari an official request for a meeting as the commander of the diplomatic station, de facto and de jure. If you think about it, he was essentially performing the duties of the ambassador of the Earth Commonwealth.
Yes, in reality his powers were noticeably less, but in a situation where a prompt response to events was required, and there was no time to send a request home and wait for a response from the government or military command, the difference was insignificant. A disgruntled and rather tired-looking Ambassador Molari appeared at the threshold of the captain's office 2 hours later. Contrary to his usual image, the Centauri was completely sober today, which made him an even less pleasant and contented conversationalist. Londa measured the owner of the office with a glance and raised an eyebrow questioningly. "Captain, how can I help you?" "Your call." The man spread his hands. "Took me by surprise, let's be honest. I was busy." "What kind of theater of the absurd is going on, Ambassador?" Sheridan interrupted the Centaurian. "I don't understand what you're talking about," Londo grimaced. "And anyway, you don't need to talk to me in that tone, Captain Sheridan. After all, I came of my own free will, although your forces have invaded Drazi and Pakmara territory. Don't tell me you're not aware of these events. It's obvious that this is destabilizing the entire region and has nothing to do with your war with the Narn. For what reason, Ambassador?" The ambassador's face became even more displeased. Molari sighed, looking gloomily at the station commander. Even without being a telepath, it was obvious that the Centauri was making great efforts not to break into completely foul language, trying to stay within the bounds of politeness and decency.
Finally, twitching his cheek, the man nevertheless answered, "I'll be frank with you, Captain. As a representative of the Centauri Republic, I can officially say only that this decision was made by the Emperor and the Republic's cabinet. Its purpose is to create a buffer zone around our territories to prevent possible, incidents." "Incidents?" John threw up his hands. "For you this may be a buffer zone, but for the Drazi it's an invasion. Do you even understand what's going on, Londo?" The captain sighed. This station was intended as a place for peaceful resolution of any conflicts. And now, dreams of peace have gone to hell, and Centauri has an extremely unenviable role in this. Don't you see it? A whole series of emotions ran across Ambassador Molari's face. Anger, despair, confusion. Even a kind of huntedness. But the Centauri pulled himself together, returned his face to a collected and serious look and looked intently into Sheridan's eyes. "Captain, I already told you, as the official ambassador of the Centauri Republic, I can give certain comments on what is happening. And the choice," he sighed, "of words in these comments will be very limited. This does not mean," Londo did not let the captain get a word in, raising his hand, "that I, as a citizen of Centauri, like what is happening in my state. But at the moment, I do not have the slightest opportunity to somehow influence what is happening. And if you have no other important topics for conversation," Molari slightly inclined his head to the shoulder, looking skeptically at the man, "I will return to my business." "I hear you, Ambassador Molari. Well, then I can only address you as the commander of Babylon 5, for whose safety I am responsible," John nodded briefly. "I ask you to influence your compatriots so that they behave more restrained, at least in public places and in large crowds of station inhabitants."
"Neither you nor I need disorder and fights. I will have exactly the same conversation with Ambassador Jakar. Do not doubt it. I will do everything in my power, Captain." Molari spread his arms, bowed briefly, and quickly left the office, leaving Sheridan alone. Something was clearly wrong with the ambassador. No, the proud Centauri's reaction to the very uncomfortable questions was logical and expected. It was good that, in addition to the official position, he still expressed his personal attitude. This gave some hope for the remnants of common sense. But the picture was still unpleasant. The terminal on the table quietly beeped, attracting Sheridan's attention. Commander Ivanova, as promised, finished the official message to Earth about the current state of affairs. The captain, sighing heavily, went to the coffee table, poured himself a full cup of black coffee, poured 4 spoons of sugar into it, and returned to his desk.
First, he needed to read the document compiled by his deputy, then add details and personal comments to it, sending it home as a result, and then he would not mind sleeping for at least a couple of hours, not thinking about anything apocalyptic, and hoping that they would not try to dismantle the station for spare parts during this modest time. Yeah, slept. 2 hours. Sheridan speaking, feeling his eye twitching, the captain accepted the incoming call from non-Ambassador Jakar. "Ambassador Jakar?" How can I... Captain? The Nan's face showed serious excitement. Forgive me if I'm interrupting you from important matters, but we need to talk. It's an urgent matter. Okay, the man sighed. Let's go to the park in an hour. I need to finish a couple of things, and this way I'll at least take a walk. John finished quietly under his breath. Of course. I'll be there, Captain.
Jakar on the display pressed his hand to his chest, bowed briefly, and disconnected.
The captain saw Jakar from the opposite end of the corridor as soon as he got out of the elevator. Narn was nervously pacing from side to side, obviously waiting for his interlocutor almost from the moment the call was made. Seeing the commander of the Babylon, the ambassador threw up his hands, taking a couple of steps towards him. Captain, forgive me once again for interrupting you, but the matter is really complicated and important. I understand, Ambassador. The man nodded, inviting him to follow him. If there is no question of secrecy, we can talk on the go. Better in the gazebo. The Narn exhaled, looking around. As you say. The man walked in silence to the nearest quiet place. However, it was quite close to walk. The Narn dove into the nearest passage between the decorative green hedges, made sure that the gazebo was not occupied by anyone, and looked out onto the path, nodding to Sheridan. So? The man sat down on one of the benches with a tired sigh, looking questioningly at the ambassador. Yes, Captain Sheridan, Carr sat down opposite the man, but a moment later he jumped to his feet, continuing to pace in front of John. A few minutes before my call to you, I received a message on the embassy line. You probably don't know, but I'll tell you at the same time. When the Centauri tried to attack my homeland, Narn, our own fleet attacked one of their resource and repair bases in the Gorash system. After waiting for a nod, the ambassador continued. Unfortunately, as I learned later, the attack was unsuccessful. All the ships that arrived there were destroyed by the enemy.
It's hard to believe.
Jakar shook his head. But I suppose our intelligence was mistaken in the number and locations of the Centauri ships. It's certainly a sad fact, Jakar. John sighed wearily. But I still don't quite understand why you asked for a meeting. Yes, sorry, Captain. The Narn nodded. I'm getting to the main point. As I was saying, I received an encrypted message. One of the cruisers sent to Gorash 7 managed to escape, with massive damage, miraculously not losing its way in hyperspace, but I understand that I shouldn't ask for such a thing. You're already doing so much to end this war. But the captain of the ship is my uncle. If... The Narn took a deep breath, calming down. Captain Sheridan, they won't make it to one of the supply bases, especially considering that Centaur will probably be looking for the survivors. But it's only 5 hours to Babylon 5, even on one engine. Ambassador. John's eyes widened. You asking me to hide an Narn warship in the station system? You understand that this is neutral territory, and if I do this, the Centauri might consider it an open entry into the war. I'm not even talking about what they'll do to me on Earth for such a gift. I understand, Captain. The Narn hung his head. But they have nothing more to hope for. I called 2 ships for escort, but they have almost 2 days to fly at full speed. The Gashnoth won't last that long in hyperspace. And going into normal space in one of the systems with a transition zone, Jakar shook his head, is a huge risk of detection, and it doesn't eliminate the problems with damage. So, the captain abruptly ran his palms over his face, concentrating. Give me a minute of silence, please. Oh, of course. The Narn nodded, sitting down on the bench and really falling silent. And Sheridan thought deeply. Jakar's request was actually extremely difficult. On the one hand, he sympathized with the Narns, even though the war was de facto started by the Narns, even though they later swapped places with the enemy, he sympathized with them, and the use of weapons of mass destruction against civilians. On the other hand, it was still a warship of one of the warring parties, a cruiser that had been damaged during the fighting. If the Earth Commonwealth captain commanding a diplomatic station in a neutral area of space suddenly decided to provide unambiguous assistance to one of the parties to the conflict, and what could be more unambiguous than sheltering or even repairing a cruiser,
This would mean drawing Earth into military action, and he had virtually no doubt that the Centaurians, and through them the Shadows, would take full advantage of this opportunity. And he hadn't even thought about the problems he personally had with the government and command. Ask Delenn or Kosh for help?
Their arguments against will be exactly the same. And if in the case of the Centauri it worries them a little less, the Shadows will not go away. And they will attack immediately. And Delenn kept saying that they are not yet ready for an open confrontation with such a serious enemy. What else? Lord Baal? No, the Goa'uld ambassador would probably help. And perhaps all the problems would be limited to his snide comments, but he might as well just shrug his shoulders, saying that such things were none of the Goa'uld Empire's business and that they were already protecting civilians. No way. The option was certainly viable, but Sheridan would prefer never to use it, at least voluntarily. Well, or at least save it for the most extreme case, when there were no other options left. More. And there were essentially no other options, although John practically closed his eyes, trying to catch the elusive idea until he finally succeeded.
Ambassador Jicquard, the captain said slowly, opening his eyes and choosing his words carefully. Captain, the Narn looked at him opally. You must understand that helping you openly, as a captain of the Earth Commonwealth, as the commander of Babylon 5, means dragging Earth into a war with Centauri. However, the man looked gloomily at the Narn, not letting him get a word in. It seems I have a solution that will pose fewer problems for all of us. I'm all ears, Captain Sheridan. Jicquard placed his hands on his chest, looking at the man with an expression of great hope. According to current international agreements, ships must respond to a distress signal received, especially if it occurs in hyperspace. And without assistance, the damaged ship risks never getting out of there. Yes, the Narn nodded, but I'm not quite there yet. I'll need the coordinates of the nearest jump zone, other than Babylon 5, that your ship can reach, continued a very gloomy Sheridan.
I'll send my ship, the Calvados, to patrol that area of space. They've certainly knocked out most of the pirates in the area, but they'll never completely wipe out that kind of scum. Contact your uncle and tell him that the ship should send out a distress signal when it's near the jump zone, but in such a way that it's obvious that it'll be able to exit into normal space on its own, or it might not be able to continue on its way. A pirate attack? Jicquard blinked in surprise. But the Gushnoth is a cruiser. What pirates? I know what it looks like, the captain stopped the ambassador. But the speculations about how it's even possible are still speculations. And the facts are that it is our duty to help a ship in trouble. I cannot bring the Gushnoth to the Babylon without risking a war with the Centaurs, but I will do everything in my power to help. I understand, Captain Sheridan. The Narn jumped up. I will contact the ship immediately, passing on instructions, and
the coordinates? I will send you the coordinates of the jump zone. First of all, yes. Bowing low, Jicquard almost ran out of the gazebo, and Sheridan let out a melancholy groan about what he had gotten himself into once again. Retirement was still a long way off, but vacation, yes. How he wished he were on some resort planet now, far away from all this madness. Lieutenant Prendick. John sighed and rose from the bench, calling the Calvados's first mate on the communicator. Captain Sheridan speaking. I'm listening, Captain, came the lieutenant's slightly surprised voice. There's work for Calvados, the man said as he entered the elevator. Come to my office, and I'll give you the details. Yes, sir. I'll be there in 10 minutes. I hope I'm not making the last mistake of my career, John muttered under his breath as Edward hung up.
Earth Commonwealth Frigate Calvados requests permission to depart.
Lieutenant Prendick, sitting in the captain's chair, contacted the station, preparing the ship to leave the dock. Calvados, this is Babylon 5, the communicator responded in Sheridan's voice. Cleared for takeoff. Good luck, Lieutenant. We don't need her, Prendick chuckled, hanging up. Having received confirmation from the station's computer about permission to leave the dock, Edward nodded to the second pilot, who was looking expectantly in his direction, giving the go-ahead for takeoff, and he himself thoughtfully leaned back in his chair. Replaying in his head the conversation with the captain, the task set by Sheridan was on the edge. One would have to be completely blind and deaf not to see the latest news about the events taking place around the Narn Centauri War.
so it was only a matter of time before one of the sides had to motivate Earth to participate in what was happening.
Приник їм сервскінання грососнув за шилецькероваля, тук твомірожі, хоплево його текль сусточейшим грешими. Місі збаружда презуміло капкерачні, ано заврігати. А прочина прознарна спірвже спросіва, але знам їх та й скажет кака, сабуже загамня, ні мне гадиме. Ні мне гади можнє шипта птісані ковує пшење, сокліші тєт крекнє, а то мня довоно ні месані, нєр можнє прожехо, засі можніші керозна, а діанар нас. Стоїле там і чему. В ті, і презнічені, а поноби радіо. Шиперци зв'яжає, шиніє марда і не споніє заврів'йо шільде. Лейтенант, зарна німа знажбає. Єс чіф, хто же...
These aren't pirates, the pilot grumbled. These are some kind of suicides. Oh, stop grumbling, Prendick chuckled. Consider the sortie as a trip to the shooting range. Even if there are pirates left here, they don't have any serious ships left. We've thinned out this rabble considerably. Edward didn't like holding back from his own crew, but the captain was right about this. Like any combat, and not only ship, the Calvados had many systems that constantly recorded sensor readings, crew conversations, and giving commands. And if, in the case of an ordinary ship, their viewing and analysis was done half-heartedly, then the frigate was still a prototype, although it showed results far beyond any tests. It would be extremely stupid to risk getting caught with their little scam on such a trifle. Sir, the communications officer spoke up. I'm detecting a distress signal on the Narn frequencies. Coordinates 1244768. Signal. The signal is standing still. It looks like someone... Wow! The man's eyes widened in surprise. What's there? If the computer is right, it's a Narn heavy cruiser. A damaged Narn heavy cruiser. Sending out a distress signal. Full combat readiness. Prendick immediately gave the order, straightening up in his chair. Follow the signal, but be careful. If this is really a damaged Narn ship, whoever battered it might still be nearby. If it's a trap, you need to be even more careful. The order was confirmed on the bridge of the Calvados, and the light flickered, changing to an alarming scarlet color. Edward exhaled. Finding the ship they needed turned out to be much easier than he feared, and everything looked exactly as Captain Sheridan said. So the frigate only had to perform a quality short performance for any, no matter how fastidious spectators, and then return home.
Unknown ship. Pressing several buttons on the armrest of the chair. The man established contact with the cruiser. This is Lieutenant Prendick, SLN-shaped Calvados. We have received your distress signal. Report the situation. Calvados! The Narn's voice came through the interference. Says Warlord Geston, Narn cruiser Gashnoth. Glad to hear from you. We found ourselves in a bit of a predicament, Lieutenant. There was a hint of irony in the captain's voice, laced with serious relief. The ship is badly damaged. The reactor is practically dead, as is a life support. What happened? Prendick frowned demonstratively. A pirate ship. The interlocutor spat out of annoyance. These scum got hold of a modified cruiser somewhere. What? The pilot blinked in surprise, turning to Prendick, who shrugged in response.
Єстєн, the lieutenant answered cautiously. Where is this cruiser now? We hit them much harder than they hit us, came from the transmitter. When we flew away, they were carried away far from the nearest buoy. Considering that we knocked out their navigation well, I don't think... I understand you. In that case, wait, we'll come closer now. Got it, Calvados. Prendick broke the calm, nodding for the pilot to continue heading in the direction of the distress signal. The silence on the bridge was palpable, the general bewilderment palpable. A pirate gang with a captured, or stolen, heavy-class ship capable of causing serious damage to a Narn heavy cruiser. This was just... Stephen, Edward turned to the sensor operator. Keep an eye on the readings. Was there a cruiser here, or is this a trap in any case? The situation is bad beyond belief. Accepted. The Gashnoth appeared in the viewport 10 minutes later.
The heavy cruiser was barely visible against the black and crimson shimmer. But even so, it was obvious that the ship had taken a lot of damage. Even from this distance, large holes in the hull and scorch marks on the plating were visible. Judging by the ship's position, they were obviously having problems with the propulsion system, as Gustin had said. But at least they had enough power to hold their position, not allowing the hyperspace currents to pull them away from the beacon signal. Scanners are clear, Lieutenant. All I see is a Narn ship. Gashnoth, Prendick called out to the Narns again. We see you. We love you too, Calvados. Thanks for your help. I'm not sure we should tow you to the Babylon. I'm afraid it might cause a scandal, Edward said, carefully. Perhaps my specialists will be able to repair critical components.
You can help us get out of hyperspace,
Gusting transmitted. Before the long-range communications failed, we managed to send for help. We just need to hold out for a couple of days until they arrive. I understand, Prendick sighed. We'll help as much as we can, Gashnov. Thank you, Lieutenant. Other souls, what if I find one? Not from Letri. Lingam seems of peel for me and we find at the moment. But if he's singing we coming from you'll find, you're leaning to know that it is I'm more ool or end. You, Klaus, a waiter at one of the establishments, only shook his head. These two began to visiting. Perhaps this was the only case when he himself, of his own free will, happily served one of his clients ordinary water, although it was not a well-known fact, but many, and Klaus among them, knew very well that the Minbari organism reacted very negatively even to negligible doses of alcohol in food and drink. The aliens received strong intoxication even from one sip, but this happened after some time, and before that, well, he would not want to be a witness, and especially the cause of an outbreak of uncontrollable aggression towards everyone around, inadequate behavior and, subsequently, a coma of one of his clients, especially such high-ranking ones. I am her closest assistant, Lanier said quietly, nodding slightly to Veer, as if talking to himself. And yet the main thing is hidden from me. A familiar feeling, Veer sighed sadly. The ambassador has changed a lot, even in appearance. Perhaps.
and the warrior caste is striving for power, not thinking about anything except their own interests. Secret meetings, conferences, messages sent to some, Koto grimaced, suspicious individuals. And understand what's going on. Lanier waved his hand, taking a sip of water. Until it's too late, he'll sit in ignorance. They don't listen to us at all. Why even try? And he never listens to me. A sad sigh was heard from the side. Irrational decisions, flirting with representatives of less developed species, calling into question the reputation of the Empire, total disappointment. Silence reigned behind the counter, and almost all of them fell silent. Lanier, Veer, Klaus, and the random customers sitting nearby. For a moment, the waiter even thought he heard the buzzing of a fly flying past, although, of course, hearing a fly on a space station was quite an event.
Veer, slowly and very carefully, turned his head towards the sound, running his eyes over the girl who had spoken. Cat ears, short green hair, decorated with a small silver hairpin, Coronia, attaché to Lord Baal, ambassador of the Goa'uld Empire. The girl let out another melancholy sigh, crunchingly biting off a small piece of cookie, and immediately washing it down from her cup. "Excuse me?" Nekuvir called out uncertainly. "Eh?" The girl twitched her ear. "I apologize if I interrupted your conversation. I hope you don't mind that I joined your little club of complaints about the boss." "We." Lanier and Veer looked at each other in confusion. "We understand you and we don't mind at all. Thank you." Coronia threw a cookie into her mouth. Finishing her coffee, nodded gratefully to the ambassadorial attaché, and shaking the crumbs that had accidentally fallen from her skirt, jumped off her chair. "It helps." "It seems," Veer watched the girl walk away, "that our ranks are growing." "That's true," Lanier nodded. "Although, to be honest, I would like to see the opposite." "Yeah, right. Same time tomorrow?" "At the same time," Kodo nodded. Under Klaus's shocked gaze, the attachés smoothly stood up, and without looking at each other, walked in opposite directions, and an involuntary thought crept into the waiter's head that perhaps he should add the psychoanalyst's service as a separate line to the menu. Now there were 3 of them. How long would it take before the assistants of the other ambassadors on the Babylon joined them? A distant binary star system, on the very outskirts of the Milky Way galaxy. I have no idea what the natives called it, but on the Minbari astronomical maps, and it was not even marked anywhere else due to its unfortunate location and remoteness, it only had a long alphanumeric name and a mark about the year it was added to the database. Surprisingly, in the depths of the Great Machine, there was little more information than the physical parameters of the stars. Composition, number of planets in the system, and that's all. There was not even a clear mention that a primordial race lived there, just a mark about the population of the system. Either the Soul Hunters developed somewhat later than the creation of the machine, which is unlikely, or they were even more secretive than the Shadows, not wanting to be counted. Or, from the point of view of the creators of the planetoid, they simply were not primordial. Interesting. 3 Hattaks, directed to the necessary coordinates, emerged from a hyperspace jump at the system's border,
immediately activating the camouflage system.
Given the ambiguity of information about the system's owners, it is better to be known as paranoid than to receive unexpected and unpleasant surprises. No modeling could predict the reaction of an ancient race to the arrival of strangers in their system, especially without an invitation. The Vorlons, for example, generally pretended that, "What ships? No one flew to us." And as for the fact that they disappeared, space is a dangerous place. They got lost along the way. As noted in the database, the Soul Hunter's homeland had a double star of a yellow dwarf, 28.212% larger and brighter than the sun, and a white dwarf of much greater brightness, rotating around a common center of mass. Despite the complex configuration and generally accepted short-livedness of such a stellar design, the luminaries had clearly been rotating like this for more than 1 billion years, without thinking too much about anyone's opinion.
The planetary family of this system itself was quite poor, which could be explained both by the very complex structure of gravitational interactions and by the naughty hands of the inhabitants, who had long ago appropriated everything unnecessary for the needs of their species. At least, during the scanning, the replicators discovered only 4 large planets, 3 of which had traces of the activity of intelligent life forms. Moreover, all of them were relatives of Earth or Mars, being thus quite suitable, if not for a quiet life right now, then for simple development during terraforming. In addition to the planets, the system also contained ancient artificial structures, recognizable by the replicators, with an accuracy of 87.421%, as orbital stations, space shipyards, and some semblance of a transition zone familiar to the locals, which, judging by the results of the scan, was currently in a switched-off and half-disassembled state.
All the structures, except for the last one, were the product of organic technologies, which, it seemed, was the standard result of the development of species on this world. Interesting. Soul Hunter ships were rarely seen in the territory of the younger races. As far as I remember, they didn't risk going near the Minbari, Volons, and I suppose the Shadows. But the Babylon 5 computer showed a single arrival of a ship of this race to the station. Here, in the home system, there was no active space traffic, intensive exchange of signals between planets, or anything similar that would indicate the presence of an advanced civilization here. Although, on the planet closest to the local luminaries, the replicator scanners discovered a number of cyclopean structures, each representing a whole complex of buildings, the central part of which was a hemispherical dome 500 meters in diameter.
What was amazing was that even the replicators could not see with absolute accuracy what was inside.
The scanners clearly outlined the outer perimeter of the walls, read their material, which coincided with the material of the surrounding buildings, but at a distance of 1 meter in depth, the scanners received a growing background of interference, as if inside there were many sources of an unknown type of radiation, generating a chaotic set of signals, perceived by the replicators as interference. The ships hovered in orbit, monitoring the space, and a thin beam of light struck the planet, transporting the form Scout to the surface. Since the replicators could not get a clear picture from the outside, the replicators would go in to look inside. Unlike the standard Spider Jr., the Scout assembled on the Hattak had a cloaking module, an expanded set of scanning devices, and a small antigrav, allowing it to take to the air if necessary.
The replicator moved along the stone wall of the building very slowly and carefully.
Confirming the results of the initial scan from orbit, the Scout determined the material of the blocks on which the building was constructed, a variant of granite with differences due to its location on a completely different planet on the other side of the galaxy from Earth. The area around the building was also paved with tiles of a similar material, giving the impression that this place was not an inhabited city, but something like a purely pragmatic object, built in the most common and uniform material. Finally, having reached a segment of the wall, which with a probability of 89.42% should have been a door or a walled-up passage inside, the Scout began to literally sniff this place.
The segment really turned out to be some kind of door. At least when scanning point blank, the replicator clearly identified some kind of lifting mechanism, clearly implying the supply of energy to it, but now completely de-energized. In general, the situation was rather strange according to all sources of information. The Soul Hunters could be considered one of the originals. The objects found in the system were clearly made using organic technologies, very similar to the samples of Vorlon and Shadow technologies I had received, with differences due to the development of civilization in other conditions. But, All the buildings that I saw, at least on this planet, were ordinary, quite developed, built of stone and other materials that require high-quality tools and equipment, but there was not a trace of organics in them. Maybe I got the wrong address?
After spending a few seconds studying the diagram and analyzing the general structure of the door's locking mechanism, the replicator made a neat hole in the stone surface, reaching the electronic filling. A carefully calibrated series of impulses, energy supplied to the right point, and the door began to creep upward with a soft creak, showering the floor with particles of stone dust. If there had been a human, or any other humanoid in the place of the replicator, it would have probably frozen like a dug-in passage no longer blocked by a door leading to… well, the closest thing to calling it was a giant library. Along the entire perimeter of the walls, as far as the optical sensors of the reconnaissance module could determine, from floor to ceiling, leaving only a small section at the pole of the dome, there was a cellular structure resembling a honeycomb. Similar structures were located in a triple spiral diverging from the center, representing a kind of bookcases, but there were far from books there. In each cell of the cupboard, small spherical objects with a diameter of 15 centimeters were glowing dimly, but clearly visible in the darkness of the room. It seems I found one of the collections. But why here? As far as I could remember, and I could remember even less than those crumbs of information shown in the original story, the soul hunters stored their loot in special storage facilities, hidden on remote and uninhabited planets of the galaxy. I don't know whether each member of their organization had their own stash, but the fact remains that such places were not in a single copy and were extremely zealously guarded by the owners from accidental encroachment. And it was the objects on the shelves that were the sources of radiation that interfered with the replicator scanners. Curious, extremely curious. The radiation did not create any problems for the communication between the replicator blocks, which was logical since it took place through subspace, but the scanners were already experiencing some difficulty in examining these objects. The scout smoothly took off into the air, continuing to examine each of the spheres floating past during its ascent. And with each new source of disturbance, the signal became clearer and clearer. The replicator network successfully filtered out unnecessary information, collecting data on the parameters of the unknown radiation and more accurately determining its sources. And they really were the spheres located on the shelves. Tens and hundreds. Thousands. Having adapted the scanning modules to the interference, the scout reported the presence of 1,443,789,112 objects in this particular room, and despite the matching basic parameters, each signal differed slightly by no more than 0.1% from its neighbors. Each one. It turned out that this is… At that very moment, the ships in orbit recorded a surge of energy, indicating the opening of a transition funnel in the immediate vicinity of the planet. A bright spark of energy flared up in space a moment later, unfolding into a shining cone from which 3 ships of an unusual configuration flew out. A complex structure resembling a thick and short spindle with an abundance of additional parts, spikes, and growths. Based on the data in the Babylon 5 databases, it was on such a ship, only heavily damaged, that one of the soul hunters flew to the station. The ships that emerged from hyperspace moved some distance apart, and the replicators recorded a scanning effect coming from them in a wide range. Apparently, the complex on the planet really was on alarm, although the replicators did not record any data transmission into space. The soul hunters' ships flew past the head-axe in orbit at full speed, ignoring them or, more accurately, simply not noticing them under the invisibility field, and moved directly to the storage facility opened by the scout. One of the ships hovered right above the dome, clearly monitoring the surroundings, and 2 hunters emerged from the other 2, which landed on the square in front of the entrance, with a cautious gait. The aliens communicated in some unknown language. At least it was absent from the Babylon 5 databases, although the replicators, having enough material for analysis, would undoubtedly be able to create a language map for communication. For now, the soul hunters quickly examined the space in front of the entrance, clearly perplexed by what or who had served to open it, if in the observed area of space there was not a single ship or fact of the presence of an alien.
But the next moment,
The ship above the complex generated an energy surge of an extremely complex and tricked out structure from which the optical camouflage of the replicator scout simply disappeared. And on the Hattaks in orbit, located at a sufficient distance, the replicators recorded a powerful interference in the work of the corresponding generators, compensating for it in 0.021 seconds. In fact, the camouflage on the pyramids blinked for a moment imperceptible to the naked eye, again restoring the structure of the field. But this was surprisingly enough, the ship above the dome jerked, sharply moving to the side and rising back into orbit, and one of the pair of hunters, exchanging glances with his fellow, darted inside the room, clearly intending to catch the intruder on their territory red-handed. The events that followed were quite stormy, fast and simultaneous.
Here a second ship rose from the surface, and like its relative, began to fly around the space above the dome in a diverging spiral, rising into orbit. The replicator scout carefully picked up one of the glass spheres with its manipulators, carefully removing it from the niche and placing it in the luggage compartment, a small volume inside the hull, shielded from the outside space by all means available to replicators. I have no idea how the sphere with the imprisoned soul, if that was it, will react to the teleportation, so it is better to play it safe and take it in the normal way. Show yourself, stranger. The hunter reacted to the disappearance of one of the spheres almost immediately, turning and raising his head clearly in the direction of the empty cell. This place does not belong to you. The scout slowly and unhurriedly headed towards the exit, flying around the alien in a wide arc.
the hunter's face reflected a mixture of confusion and anger. It seemed that although he had managed to detect the disappearance of one of the spheres, he could no longer see it behind the replicator screen. The alien ran to the rack, almost sniffing its shelves, trying to figure out where the one who had robbed them had gone. And in orbit, the Kattakis parted ways, letting the planet's masters pass by. The hunters, having jumped out into open space without having found the aliens, periodically emitted the already familiar energy pulses, clearly intended to somehow reveal the hiding guests. The second time, the replicators already had an idea of what kind of impact was supposed to occur, so they neutralized it very quickly, not allowing the camouflage to disappear. But the situation was, it's interesting to play hide and seek when one of the players is invisible endlessly. And I'm here for a completely different purpose, so...
На арена свасужимося, ес че грола дуа, питнев у леси. Коли охойду так просто пшисем гытризуе. Рисиш нагу жоза да каглибатрака. А вибиуше дребини усману, я ведуто, вниз верями, вмітуйшо би сталітаца калакаца пайна ятлія да гуауд емпайр. Запланений было выводами речения газиростовужи, то без кабырю делания темной воловьерта сказания не завелицанета. Да гуауд емпайр клажение кремусание, но замное полание можем о том бирбываное ятление, тотерское имприне, и отмазысвающее монио стоощи. Сталюна не кряще вонью потонья на забыла саркадела, весне наветы и на ниж деланиями констаты, и эту монет 300 ение севастовроши стевят. Да замны половоже, это пайна не завыла тон, кажется, мерка, расшиблане. И это мне выйти стране, мов родились это кападе благразового подылогыта. Она в лесе те проврелина, у нового послежена клеваниями это не забыло ми. Зевайс вам и не такие стуаны, да и уроханем дел, и то новерты. Поэтому сталиота палания собственной в ризи. Така медавши строоту, разведілання я роді сумблі. Гронтужний ахатек так новий порше ступеня хатіх, да зазв'яза.
The next thing the Soul Hunter's ships did was hit by greenish translucent beams, concentrating on the nearest Huttak. Have you ever wondered if a replicator's body could experience Spanish shame? Now I know for sure it can. The greenish beams converged on one point of the hull. The replicator blocks recorded an impact similar to the attack of the shadow ship, only many times weaker and with minor 4.582 differences in the radiation spectrum. And that's it. The attack of the two ships could not even destroy the outer layer of the Huttak's casing, let alone cause it much more extensive damage. In the place of the direct impact, the blocks only shifted slightly, absorbing the kinetic energy of the charged particles that came with the attack. The ships made another attempt, then a third, a fourth. Each time the parameters of the beams changed slightly, as if the hunters were trying to select a more effective set of them. The energy saturation grew, but
Even taking into account all the changes, the best result was a slight heating of the surface area, which was, if you think about it,
a noticeable achievement. The replicators did not have time to completely absorb the incoming energy on such a small surface. The third ship, clearly not risking taking off, remained on the planet's surface, and its pilot, as shown by the data from the reconnaissance camera, hovering in the air at the very exit from the dome, stood in a tense pose, peering at the flashes that illuminated the hazy sky. Finally, realizing the futility of the attacks, and apparently abandoning their fellow to the mercy of fate, the hunter ships, having given the last most powerful salvo, scuttled with ever-increasing speed to the border of the system, trying to fly along a complex trajectory to complicate the possible aiming and response of the enemy. No, my friends, we haven't finished.
From the closest attack to the retreating ships, two fast-flying, blinding blue sparks cut through space, each hitting its target. The effect of the hit from the ship's version of the Snicktail, which can easily act as an analog of an EMP weapon, with a guarantee of disabling any and all electronic components of the enemy ships, cutting off all systems without irreparable damage to the ships themselves, was exactly the opposite. Unlike hand weapons, the salvo produced had a much greater energy saturation, which should have, if not de-energized the electronics in the hunter's ships, which might not have been there at all, then with the guarantee of de-energizing the ships themselves, affecting their analog of the nervous system. But
The hunters' ships seemed to have received a wonderful kick in the ass, shuddering with their entire body, for a moment clearly losing orientation in space, and then, having corrected the trajectory, continued flying in the same direction. Strange. Interesting. Curious. I didn't see any fundamental sense in destroying the fugitives, but turning my gaze to the ship that remained on the surface was quite appropriate, especially since its pilot, it seemed, had received a message from his friends and at that very moment was hurriedly running from the dome to the parked ship, intending to repeat their escape maneuver. No way. We'll communicate differently with you. One of the Hataks in orbit dropped sharply, casting its shadow over most of the complex. A wide, glowing teleportation beam struck down, catching both the hunter and his ship with a soft, grinding sound. Interlude. The day turned out to be extremely long visit of two officials from Earth who arrived at the station to inspect the night watch and analyze the situation of the conflict between Narn and Centaur. Mr. Wells and Frederick Lentz. It would seem that Sheridan should be glad that the government finally responded to all his reports and sent diplomats, official diplomats, to try to act as mediators in the conflict between the two peoples and ultimately resolve the ever-worsening situation. But intuition told the captain that everything would not be as rosy as it might seem. And John was used to trusting his instincts, especially in terms of communicating with bureaucrats and employees of all sorts of ministries. And this instinct almost howled as soon as the man began to think over the recent events. It was a good thing that the method he had come up with to help Jakar seemed to have worked without problems.
Not more than an hour ago, Edward Prendick from the Calvados reported discovering a regime Narn ship badly damaged by pirates and providing them with emergency assistance in repairing critical components and escorting them to the coordinates specified by the ship's captain, where the frigate handed them over hand to hand to their relatives who had responded to the distress signal. A completely legal and consistent entry was made both in the Calvados's captain's log and in the station's computer. After all, the lack of an indication of the class of the rescued ship could well be attributed to some carelessness on the part of the lieutenant filling out the paperwork. The Narn ambassador, having accidentally met Sheridan in one of the corridors, only bowed deeply, pressing his hands to his chest and expressing enormous gratitude to the man, and practically with his lips only, whispered, "Thank you," immediately continuing on his way.
And even the Calvados
which continued patrolling in the indicated sector, did not cause concern. There really could be unfinished pirates there after all. This fraternity was depressingly tenacious. Captain Sheridan! The gloomy Mr. Lentz, who entered the station commander's office, made John want to roll his eyes and sigh heavily. Good evening, Mr. Lentz. The man nodded wearily. How did your meetings with the League ambassadors go? Thank you. Quite successfully. The official nodded. I think I'll take a break for a couple of days to analyze the information I've received and then, however, Frederick twitched his cheek. I didn't come about this issue. I've received some alarming information, and I'd like to discuss it with you. Alarming information? Sheridan raised an eyebrow, inviting his interlocutor to sit down in the chair. As far as I understand, you have been conducting training for fighter pilots for the last week. Is that true?
Yes, that's true. John nodded in surprise.
Pilots need to keep themselves in shape, especially since the fighter fleet is currently being modernized and they need to master the new machines. That's reasonable. But Mr. Wells informed me that you were practicing combat tactics against pilots of the Centauri Republic. This is a perfectly reasonable decision, Mr. Lenz. The captain cut the man off. At the moment, the Centauri Republic is waging military action against the Narns, but the consequences of these actions have been felt in full by completely uninvolved worlds. Are you crazy, Captain? Frederick threw up his hands. This will jeopardize the very purpose of my arrival here. Look, Frederick. John leaned towards his interlocutor, resting his elbows on the table. My job is to ensure the safety of Babylon 5 and the surrounding systems. The Centauri have repeatedly shown themselves to be very negative and unpredictable.
If for the safety of the station, I have to train Zeta Squadron to shoot down a cruiser with a fighter, that's what I'll do. Centauri, Narn, or even, God forbid, Vorlon. I understand your reasons, but this... The man sighed heavily, waving his hand. Okay. I suppose I can explain the necessity and reasonableness of such a step to Ambassador Malari if the issue comes up in our conversation, but... Captain, you provided assistance to a Narn ship using the Earth Commonwealth frigate Calvados. This is a warship. Do you understand what this looks like? If the details of this assistance become known, it will put an end to all my work. I don't know where you get this data from and how you get access to service information. Sheridan began to feel a dull irritation from the situation. But I don't understand what you are not satisfied with. The officer commanding the Calvados acted in full compliance with international space law and the charter of the Earth's space fleet. The frigate was patrolling in one of the sectors of space adjacent to the Babylon and picked up a distress signal. What do you mean? Lenz frowned. Paragraph of the charter, number 47 con. Sheridan read from memory. Officers of the space fleet are obliged to respond to distress signals and provide assistance to any ships if they are not currently participating in military operations against Earth. I admit, the man spread his hands. This information can cause political upheaval, but the commander of the Calvados acted completely within the framework of the charter and the law. But you understand how the Centaurians might perceive this, Mr. Lentz. For your information, the Centauri already consider everyone but themselves to be second-class sentient. Well, Sheridan chuckled. Except the Vorlons and Minbari, I suppose. You shared me reports to Vizmisze, Mumienco Bodo.
Yes, Miroda Badi. Is Babylon 5 Nijeba Ambassador's Lord Bal?
I'm not suggesting anything. The captain shook his head. After all, this is your job, and I'm just doing mine as best I can, ensuring myself, not wanting to complicate relations with a race that has essentially already taken half a step towards vassalage to an intergalactic empire. I don't know if they were jokes when Lord Baal talked about his relatives visiting ancient Earth. Sheridan twitched his cheek, and I don't want to know. Let him call pagan sacrifices to the gods. The man made quotation marks with his fingers. The dense cargo cults of uneducated aborigines, but better to be known as a living paranoid than a dead simpleton. Don't you think? You're definitely not trying to make my workday easier. Frederick Lenz dropped his hands in a stupor, looking straight ahead. It was obvious from the man's appearance that firstly, he had never even tried to look at what was happening on the station from this angle, and secondly, he had now completely ceased to understand how he should complete the task entrusted to him by the president. On the one hand, concluding a peace treaty with the Centauri looked quite reasonable and promised an undoubted far-reaching benefit. On the other,
Lord Bull. Even the crumbs of information collected about this afterward already made him feel insecure and unmotivated fear, and especially in the context of his concern for the side of the conflict opposite the Centaurians. Now you understand me, Captain Sheridan nodded with satisfaction. I've been living in this theater of the absurd for a year now. Just so you know, Mr. Lentz, on weekends I have two fragile and tender cat girls who easily carry out a platoon of Marines feet first, just because they prevented them from eating cakes.
And then a deadly epidemic begins, which happens simply because some aliens were unable to overcome religious prejudices, considering this disease punishment from the gods. I'm not even talking about the attempt to bomb a densely populated world with a prohibited weapon. Sheridan shook his head. If only you knew how tired I am of dragging all this out and cleaning up the mess with the three of us, Ivanova and Mr. Garibaldi. You should also be grateful to me that I did not ask for a vacation and did not resign 6 months ago. I'm afraid, the official side, even though I can understand your arguments, it doesn't make the situation any easier. You have your job, Mr. Lentz, and I can't influence it in any way. It's outside my jurisdiction. At the same time, the man looked gloomily into the eyes of his interlocutor. I have my job, regulated by the Charter, current legislation, and orders of the General Staff.
Unless you have other official orders on my account, I will continue to do what I do, and exactly as I do it. And now, if you have no more urgent matters, I would like to drink a cup of tea, take a shower, and go to bed. As you rightly noted, this has not been the easiest day possible. There was an awkward pause in the room, during which the extremely thoughtful official reflexively continued to stroke the large black cat. What the hell? Mr. Lentz looked at his hands and the contents of his knees in horror. Oh yeah, Sheridan sighed demonstratively. We also have a telepathic cat walking around the station, capable of subjugating the mind of a level 12 psycho telepath. But who? The man paused dramatically, watching the changes on Frederick's face as he realized what he was being told. Uses his powers to be scratched, petted, and have his litter box taken out. Because he's a cat, and only then a telepath. Mariav! Behemoth nodded weightily, satisfied with life and the balance in the universe. Yes, I'll bring you some sour cream now. Can I? He looked to Captain Lentz with a very pitiful expression on his face. What, sour cream? No, whiskey. Yes, Sheridan nodded with some sympathy. And yes, Mr. Lentz, welcome to Babylon 5. If you don't go crazy in the next couple of days, nothing will ever affect your psyche again. 722. Have you ever experienced that dreadful mixture of Spanish shame, bewilderment, and parental pride for your growing children? I haven't either. Until today. Focusing on delivering the Soul Hunter's planet-grown goodness to the lab complex, I was distracted for a while from what was happening on Babylon 5 itself. And if Sheridan's potential political problems due to his ingeniously executed aid to the damaged Narn cruiser worried me about as much as the poor hemp crop in Pablo Escobar's backyard, that is, not at all. But what was happening in my own embassy cabin? Yuki! This is a disaster! Corone, her eyes wide, looked from her terminal screen to her sister and back. What happened? Yuki asked, surprised and already scared, just in case. Our favorite cafe is out of cakes! Look! Corone pointed with a trembling finger at the line, temporarily out of stock, next to their favorite treat. But that happens sometimes, right? They have to order. Babylon 5 can't do everything on its own. There's a huge cargo traffic here. I know, I ask. Yes, that's usually how it happens, but wait! Corone thoughtfully tapped her finger on her chin, staring intently at the display, and a list of commands for accessing the station's dock service documentation appeared in the replicator network, including the ship arrival schedule and invoices for their cargo. After their recent quarantine, transport traffic has not yet returned to normal. Many carriers are afraid to carry anything directly to Babylon, preferring to sell cargo in the colonies. Do you understand what this means? No eclairs? She looked at Yuki's sister in confusion, her ears hanging down. No eclairs, and cream tarts, and... But what should we do? I think... Corone frowned. I've got it. We can make the eclairs ourselves. But if the necessary cargo was not delivered to Babylon 5, why do we need cargo? We can synthesize the necessary products with the Asgard beam. So, what do we need for eclairs? Let's start with them. Corona scoured the culinary resources available on the web at an incredibly fast pace, bringing together all the existing recipes for an eclair-type dessert. In essence, Neka had just created the perfect eclair, as she thought it should be. I'll get the dishes.
Yuki jumped up and started clanging in the kitchen corner, taking out bowls and a small food processor. What?
So, milk, butter, salt, sugar.
Each ingredient spoken was accompanied by a thin beam of teleportation, after which a small container with the indicated product appeared on the tabletop.
Girls,
I carefully approached Korone, looking around at what's going on. What's going on here?
Lord Baal, please leave. Don't interfere.
Korone jumped up and started pushing me out of the cabin. Go, take a walk in the park. Scratch Behemoth behind the ear or at least have some tea with the captain. But you could have just... Lord Baal! The girl almost growled, almost giving me a kick in the ass, but still pushing me out into the corridor. I definitely don't fully understand what the hell just happened. They're making eclairs, but they could just be created as easily as individual ingredients. And
They would be exactly as you programmed them, but now you need to add water and butter to the milk, and then bring the mixture to a boil. Came from the closing door of the cabin. No, I better go for a walk, and tea isn't such a bad idea. Yeah,